On a certain day, at a certain hour, minute, and seconds, the protagonist crossed and became a soul stuck inside a space satellite. He's been floating for thousands of years and have witnessed the continent from the beginning when there was not a single mammal capable of walking upright. To the moment when the first man-made fire was made, but for some reason from that moment on, everything suddenly went faster. It was like his perception of time itself was broken. Then the humanoid creatures rapidly created civilizations, forming tribes and even early city and states. The humanoid creatures managed to master the ability to use magic. From then on, competed with other race for their survival in that continent. They conquered each other by chanting the names of different gods they worship, fighting to the very end. So the continent was populated by various kingdoms with various faith. Before long, the kingdom were all destroyed and all living being perished. Then from the ruins, new humanoid creatures emerged and started populating the continent. Time moved too fast, so the protagonist was unable to process such information. Suddenly, the protagonist saw a large creature resembling a dragon, but he didn't know how and where it came from. Soon, the protagonist realized that it wasn't the world moving fast, but he had realigned, so his conscious started fading rapidly. The space satellite, which had been staying still for long, activated to reboot the protagonist, but it failed and couldn't do so. The protagonist continuously chanted his will to survive as the satellite activated an escape protocol for him. Then, with a zap from the space satellite, the protagonist, whose consciousness was fading, realized that his conscious hasn't disappeared. The protagonist, who was sent falling by the space satellite like a shooting star, was confused and questioned what was happening. The space satellite, which had been holding and imprisoning the protagonist for a long time, sent the protagonist into the planet nearest to it as a bright light shone down. Down in the continent, a man lay down in a dark space, breathing rapidly to take in air, and he did that continuously. This man was the protagonist. He opened his eyes and looked around, where he was realizing that he was in a tomb. He was frightened of death and tried speaking out that he was in good shape, not like the old tomb, so he shouldn't be killed. Inside the tomb, some newcomers just closed the huge door of the tomb they came in through. A lady sat down at the side, painting heavily. A subordinate reported to another lady, more matured, named Hetty, that the door had been sealed. Then she complimented him. Sir Brian, who was complimented, was one of the people who was led into the tomb after some rest lady Hetty used magic to make a fire. As they walked further into the tomb, a young lady called Hetty her aunt and questioned what the place they were in was. Hetty told her that the place they were in was the final rest of the ancestor of the Cecil family, and for her not to do anything disrespectful. The young lady held her staff close to her chest as she stated that it felt like no one had been there for a very long time. Hetty told her that ever since Marquis de Grumman took the sacred relic from this tomb and participated in a rebellion that almost led to the destruction of his family, here had been sealed off. Every descendant of the Cecil family knows how to open this place. However, due to family order, no one dares to barge in unless it is a matter of life and death. Hetty told the young lady that they were the first people to set foot here in more than hundreds of years. The young lady jokes that they were now in that situation of life and death and questioned if the ancestors will forgive them for entering the tomb. Hetty looks down sadly and didn't give the young lady the answer she needed. Instead, she walked closely to the door in front of them. Hetty examines the door and then pressed a mechanism in the door. Then a green light shone brightly on it from her hand. This green light spread throughout the door and activated the other mechanism in the huge door. The huge door trembled when all the mechanism had been activated and stayed opening little by little from down. Each of the people outside, both the knights, the young lady, and Hetty, waited patiently as the door rumbled and opened completely. Inside this floor, only one tomb can be seen. Then one of the people questioned if it was the tomb of their ancestors. Entering, Hetty noticed that something was different near the ancestors' tomb and stared intently right at the place. Hetty immediately became alert and shouted out that someone was there. Then everyone stood in a fighting stance. The young lady looked at Betty, another lady, near her and told her to look for somewhere to hide to avoid being implicated in the fight. The young lady with blue ribbon and brown eyes turned back and looked at the person rushing to attack her group. A young girl with long ears and dressed in black cloth jumped out and crossed blade with Knight Brian. The long-eared girl knocked all the knight, including the young lady and Hetty, out of her way as they stood still, all stunned. The long-eared girl held the danger in her hands and flashed past all of them without care as she rushed towards a particular destination. She rushed towards the entrance of the huge door, trying to escape, but the distance was a bit too far. Lady Hetty regained her sense and created a small magic fireball, sending it towards the long-eared girl who was escaping to the entrance of the door. The small magic ball flew over and landed in the front of the long-eared girl, then it exploded and frightened the little lowly girl. The knights were fast and pointed their sword at the long-eared girl, questioning who she was and how she dared to enter the ancestral tomb of their Cecil family. The lowly girl opened up her mouth and screamed out that she hadn't stolen anything, but Hetty was angry and shouted at her. The young lady held her staff with one hand and pointed at lowly girl, questioning what she had done to their Cecil family ancestors. Cold sweat slides down the lowly face as she stammers and told the people surrounding her not to harm her. She told them not to kill her yet, but to first check the ancestors' tomb because something was wrong with it. Just as she was still speaking, the ancestors' tomb shook continuously and all their attention turned to it. The young lady held her staff and watched as the tomb clacked, while Hetty prayed that the ancestor rest in peace, since the intruder will face her punishment. The lowly girl stated that when Hetty was done talking, she might as well hold down her ancestor's tomb. Cold sweat slides down from the knight's face as they watched the ancestor's tomb, feeling that it was too horror-like. Just as they were all watching the ancestor tomb, a hand with black gloves on popped up from a space opened in the side of the tomb. This made the calm young lady jump up and used her staff to attack the tomb, shouting that her lord ancestor rest in peace. The cover of the tomb crushed down on the hand, making the person inside curse out, questioning who had hit him. Young lady was shocked and turned her head towards Hetty, telling her that she might have disrespected the ancestor because of her action. Hetty was stunned but reacted very fast. She shouted for young lady to get out from the tomb as she activated her power ready to attack. But then she stopped and told young lady that it might be the resurrection of an ancestor due to the corruption of the sacred remain of the ancestor tomb by the monsters. Just as she was still speaking, the ancestor in the tomb, who was annoyed due to the attack from the young lady, kicked open the tomb cover with force. Then, right in front of all the people, the ancestor sat up, making them shocked and speechless, especially the young lady near the tomb. The lowly, sitting on the ground with a sword placed on her neck, stated that their ancestor had risen with a worried look on her face. This ancestor was none other than the protagonist who had just possessed the body of the Cecil family ancestor. He looked at his trembling hand angrily. Then he looked at the young lady near him, who was already shaking because he knew that she was definitely the one who attacked him. The protagonist questioned if she was the one who just smashed his hand, and the young lady, who was already scared, tearfully stated that she was sorry. Before the protagonist could say another word, the young lady jumped away from the tomb and hid behind Hetty. Hetty blocked the scared young lady and turned to the protagonist, asking if he knew who he was. The protagonist became serious and stated thinking of who he was, although he knew he had possessed the body of the Cecil family ancestor. The protagonist was shocked that he was still alive and questioned who he was. Then suddenly, a large information was sent into his memory. Those were the memories of the body he occupied, and through this memory he realized who he was. He touched his forehead and replied to Hetty that he was Gawain Cecil, the founder of the Kingdom of Ansu. Young lady continued hiding at Hetty's back while Hetty signs out in relief, after realizing that the ancestor was still the same. The protagonist held his forehead confused and questioned Hetty on what year they were in. The young lady hiding behind Hetty answered that the year was 735 of the Anso calendar, and he had been sleeping for over 700 years. Hetty introduced herself and young lady Rebecca to the protagonist, pleading to him for forgiveness due to Rebecca's youthfulness and lack of understanding. Still sitting inside the tomb, the protagonist was shocked by what he heard. He never thought he would one day have great-great-great-granddaughters. He felt that it was too unbelievable. He asked them to help him up as he tried coming out from the tomb. Lady Rebecca happily rushed forward, stretching her hands out to help the protagonist come out from the coffin. The protagonist was speechless and dumbfounded by her enthusiasm as he watched her held his hand, helping him out from the coffin. Hetty sweats for the young lady who didn't have the understanding of what was happening and acts recklessly in front of the ancestor. The protagonist questioned what the cloth he wore was made from, since it could last for 700 years. Rebecca happily replied that it was elf-made lunar trail fabric. Feeling the material, the protagonist exclaimed that it was truly an advanced technology, but Rebecca couldn't understand. She felt that the ancestor's knowledge was so profound and great, as she watched him standing and thinking about something with a cold look. On the other hand, the protagonist thought that after so many years he could finally walk straight, compared to other protagonists who became gods and Buddha in a novel. The protagonist stepped down gently from the low stairs of the ancestor tomb and walked forward with the help of Lady Rebecca. He asked what was going on as he saw a lady with long ears sitting on the ground with sword pointed at her. The lowly girl teared up as she pitifully stated that she was there to take refuge before the incident happened. Hetty angrily questioned if she had to go all the way into the deepest chamber of their ancestor's tomb in order to hide. It didn't make sense. Hetty felt that the lowly girl had another motive for doing that, so she pointed at her and told the protagonist she was the one who disturbed his slumber. The lowly girl was scared and trembled when the protagonist questioned if she was the one who woke him up as he exercised his hand. The lowly girl immediately stated that she didn't do anything, although she went into the ancestor chamber to hide, but she didn't do anything to him. Before she could say more, the protagonist summarized everything that happened and thanked her for waking him up. Everywhere became silent, and everyone looked at the protagonist dumbfoundedly. Hetty, who was expecting the protagonist to punish the lowly girl, was stunned. The protagonist further told them to let her go because it won't be good for four-matured knight to apprehend a little girl. The protagonist told them that it wasn't compatible with the essence of being a knight with chivalry. Lady Hetty interrupted the protagonist, telling him that the lowly had barged into his tomb and it was wrong. Everywhere, quite down, as Hetty tries to explain to the protagonist, she suspects the lowly girl had a motive for going into the ancestor chamber. The protagonist told her there was no problem with letting her go since he didn't see any reason to hold her, and thanking her for waking him up is the best choice. Lowly girl was surprised and spoke out, stating that he was the eldest among them, so he shouldn't go back on his word. The protagonist didn't think much about what she said. Instead, he questioned what the lowly girl name was. The lowly girl smiled and stood up from the ground and placed her hand on her waist. Then she answered that her name was Amber. The protagonist held his chin, thinking about the lowly girl name while inspecting her features from head to toe. After thinking for some while, he stated that she does look like some wood elf from the forest. Hetty interrupted before he could say further, telling him it wasn't time for small talk since they weren't safe there, and Rebecca nodded in agreement. The protagonist supported his chin with one hand and told Hetty to tell him what was going on, since she looked anxious. She told him they had been ambushed by monsters everywhere outside, and she and the Salders fought in the citadel until the last moment before they escaped. The protagonist felt that it was a terrible mess to wake up in this situation, and since the monsters have already taken over the surface, it would be suicide to go outside. But then again, he was clueless about something, so he asked Hetty what exactly those monsters outside she was talking about was. Hetty told him she presumed that the monsters might be subspaces of the demons, but the demons had not been seen for many years, so how they produce in large scale was unknown. The protagonist was startled when Rebecca questioned if he couldn't defeat the monster outside with his strength. Rebecca's eyes almost began to flash as she stated that he was the most powerful knight in the whole Anzu kingdom and northern continent. Gawain Cecil, who was one of the greatest heroes, was known as the second founding legend, who saved a lot of people when the empire was crumbling. The protagonist searched his memory and was shocked to find out that Gawain was a legendary hero. Although his life was short and glorious, he set out from young and became the youngest of the pioneering horsemen of his days. But such a glorious life was like a candle that burned too hot. And this legendary man exhausted his life in his last battle against the dark tide. And for who knows sake, the protagonist had possessed a person who is beyond compare. Rebecca was looking at him hopeful eyes, and even Hetty, who seemed the most matured and composed, was looking at him with some anticipation. But the person they were looking at was the protagonist, not Gawain Cecil. He told them he had slept too long, so he was unsure of how capable he was now. Gawain looked down at his hand. It was a hand of a warrior, thick and tough with calluses, but also with great power. The protagonist told Hetty and the others that they were not sure of how powerful the monsters outside could be, so it was smarter for them to find a way to get around those monsters. Rebecca immediately told him that the drawbridge had been destroyed and several other roads had also been blocked. The protagonist told them that the Cecil domain used to be part of the southern defense line of the kingdom, and there was a secret tunnel that can lead them outside, which was beneath the castle. Rebecca was pleasantly surprised and stated that if there was such a thing, it was good to find it immediately. Then she asked the protagonist to lead the way. The protagonist coughed and stated that there was a problem, even though he knew there was a passage here. He spread out his hands and told them that he only knows how to get there from the castle, but not from that ancestral tomb. Rebecca was surprised and questioned why he didn't know the way out, even when he had stayed here for a long time. Everyone was speechless. The protagonist's face became dark as he wondered if Rebecca had an injury in her head when she fought with the monsters. He patiently told her he was dead, so he couldn't know how his grave looked like. Hetty's face grew pale. She had the feeling that this disappointing descendant would be the death of her ancestor. Hetty sighed and calmly stated that they couldn't go back to the same route since it had been occupied by the monsters. The protagonist stated that they had to find another way out as he searched his inherited memory since it had been 700 years. The foundations, however, remain intact, and the entrance he mentioned should still be in place, so that should be fine. The protagonist extended his hand to a soldier beside him and told him to lend his sword to him for a moment. After taking the long sword from the soldier, the protagonist drew a sketch on the ground, though the sketch were drawn in a hurry, but the different section of the castle could be made out quite clearly. Rebecca looked curiously at the protagonist's sketch and stated that the wine cellar and the granary are still there, but she didn't know there was a third room. The protagonist chuckled and stated that it was not a room, but a compartment concealed between the walls and supports beams by some architectural tricks. He told her that the Cecil pioneers built it according to the demand of a stronghold during war, which can be used for emergency evacuation and as a supply route when under siege. He gave Rebecca a strange look and questioned if she really didn't know about this because it was the knowledge which was passed down in the Cecil family generation. Rebecca looked down embarrassed and stuttered, not knowing what to say as a reply. Hetty bit her lip with a troubled look and told the protagonist that they had failed to live up to his expectation. They had been through many things. After listening to what she said, the protagonist told her that once they left the tomb, they are going to give him an explanation of what happened in these 700 years. What's the most urgent task right now is to find a way from the catacombs to the secret passage. Then Rebecca, Hetty, and Brian squatted down and studied the sketch, although they were familiar with the Cecil clan castle, but not familiar with how the tomb was constructed. Rebecca was frustrated. Even before the tomb was sealed 100 years back, the descendants of the Cecil family could only enter the tomb on a few rare occasions. Just as they were unable to find a solution, the lowly girl who stayed obediently in a corner suddenly spoke, stating that she knew where the secret chamber was. Immediately, everyone in the tomb turned their attention to the half-elf thief, and she cringed her neck back. Hetty, Rebecca, and Brian came very close to her and stared coldly at her. Hetty questioned how she knew about the secret chamber. Lowly girl was a little scared and stuttered, not knowing how to reply. She felt very intimidated by the trolls' look. But seeing the encouraging look from the protagonist, she became bold and told them she came from that place. So she assumed it might be the secret chamber they were talking about. Since she was asked, she had to say it. The protagonist nodded and approved her telling her to lead the way since she knew it. The lowly girl patted her chest and stated that as long as the protagonist forgot about her digging his grave, everything was settled. Hetty glared at the blabbering lowly girl and spark flew in the air while the lowly girl looked up at Hetty proudly. Hetty was annoyed, so she grabbed her staff and started walking towards the entrance of the tomb. Lowly girl led the way in that front, and the others, including the three knights, followed her lead. But only the protagonist didn't follow, and that made Rebecca curious, and she called out to him questioning why he wasn't following them. The protagonist whispered silently that he also needs to bring a weapon since the trip was dangerous and the others have their own weapons. He stated that he had to get a weapon too, so he walked towards the coffin he came out from when he woke up. Rebecca called out to him, but he didn't answer her. Instead, he walked up and put his hand inside the coffin to pick up a sword. The moment he wielded the long sword, a familiar feeling arose. It was as if every wrinkle on the sword fitted seamlessly with the lines on his palm. Rebecca's eyes widened at the sight of the black long sword, and even her voice shook as she stated that it was the legendary founder's sword. Hearing that, Hetty, who had already walked to the entrance, immediately turned back and stared at the sword in excitement. The protagonist sighed and stated that currently the sword was only a sharp sword as he swung it to test its strength. Since it had been 700 years, even if the weapon received elven blessings to be protected from wear and decay, the magic in it had long dispersed. Since the magic in the weapon had already dispersed, the protagonist stated that he didn't know how long it will take to be recharged back to how it used to be. The protagonist remembered something and told them that he had a shield, and questioned if it was not buried with him. Then he turned and looked at the coffin. There was a small stone platform, but there was nothing on the stone platform. He questioned how he lost it, and Hetty had a grim face as she told him that his descendant, Cecil Grumman, took it from his tomb and lost it on the battlefield. She hesitated when she spoke. Obviously, there were many things that she left out. If not, she didn't know how angry the ancestor will become if he knows the remaining truth behind it. The protagonist called Grumman a disgrace and thought that luckily Grumman didn't go so crazy as to take his whole outfit from the coffin. After coming back to the stone hall from the ancestral tomb, Rebecca looks around, then waved her hand, telling Betty to come out. A little girl smaller than Rebecca came out wearing a skirt made of coarse material and holding tightly to a pan in her hand. Her face was filled with apprehension. Rebecca introduced How to the protagonist as the castle-maid servants who was left behind by the first group of rescue, and when they saw her, they allowed her to join their group. Then Rebecca wanted to introduce the protagonist to Betty, the maid with apprehension on her face when an accident happened. A small quick from above the thumb interrupted Rebecca's introduction, and everywhere became quite as they wanted to know what was happening. The tomb shook even more, making everyone inside tremble even more, and Rebecca and the others were unbalanced and startled. The protagonist thought in his mind that it was no longer time to talk. They had to escape from there, or they will die miserably if the stone fall on them. The protagonist held his sword firmly and turned to look at the lowly girl, then he told her to lead the way immediately. The lowly girl, the great stealth user, professional manipulator of shadows, grave-digging, and enthusiast girl, had a wise saying. The part is right there. The door is nothing more than an illusory ornament. Put your mind, and you will be able to open even the royal treasury. With a little shadow magic and some understanding of the ancient seals and a tiny bit of fluck, the lowly easily broke the seal on the Cecil clan's ancestor tomb. Then a passageway that even Hetty and Rebecca, the Cecil clan descendants, didn't know about appeared in front of everyone, and they were all amazed. Perhaps celery did not exist in this world, but to Amber, opening the gate to the ancient tomb was something that did not even require celery. Everyone then follows the lowly girl into the passageway, which was built with rock and spirit-subduing bricks. Then Hetty questioned if Amber was really just a thief. The lonely girl, with more days to answer that she was only just a little bandit trying to make a living by stealing. Walking in the front, she stated that since she was the descendants of the forest elves, she respected the spirit of the past ancestors, so she will never do something like digging graves. The protagonist's expression changed to a look of scorn at her claim, and questioned if she cared to explain why she was so proficient in digging grave. She stated that picking locks and breaking seals are basic skills for her clan, and it was not wrong for her to be proficient at the basic skills. At this time, Rebecca, who was walking in the middle of the team, suddenly asked if Amber was a resident of the Cecil territory. The lowly girl brows furrowed as she pondered before stating that she had been in the Cecil territory for several years but have never applied for full citizen. According to the Cecil territory rules, those who have lived in the territory for more than 3 years and paid their taxes on time are considered citizen. The lowly girl turned to Rebecca and questioned if she could be considered a resident of the Cecil family because of these conditions. Rebecca shook her head and told her that if she didn't apply, then she can't be considered a resident. Then lowly girl dragged her syllable and questioned why she asked. Rebecca seriously stated that she was the lady of the Cecil territory, so it is her responsibility to protect anyone from her resident territory. Lowly girl happily stated that she should have said that earlier, and Rebecca, with a straight face, replied that it was too late. The protagonist looked at Rebecca and then at the lowly girl and shook his head. Although he woke up in a mess, but the feeling of being a human was much better than lying in a coffin. He then turned and looked at Hetty walking behind him. This lady was his granddaughter of who knows how many generations after him. She had taken furtive glance at him several times, but kept quiet, and he knew she wouldn't speak so. He stated that if she had any questions, she could ask him. Hetty hesitated before speaking, stating that she still could not believe that he was alive and questioned if he really was the one. The protagonist stated that indeed he was still the same Gawain Cecil, the founder of Anzu Kingdom 700 years ago. But these does not prove anything, and even an historian can tell the same story. The protagonist looked at her and questioned if she was trying to confirm his authenticity. Then she looked apologizing at him, stating that he should forgive her for doubting him. Hetty stated that it was really something. Although she has heard stories of resurrection from the dead, it was another story to see it with 2 eyes. She have heard that holy night and silver moon elves can rely on holy light and mystical art to persevere them from death for decades. However, she have never heard of a human knight coming back to life, talk more of someone who died 700 years ago resurrecting. Although the protagonist had some idea of what happened, but pretended he didn't know, telling her that he himself didn't know how. The protagonist stated that perhaps it had something to do with the elemental blessing he received when he was pioneering, which might have changed his constitution. Although Hetty still had some doubt, but there was nothing she could do about it but to believe what he said, so she replied in a questioning tone if that was how it happened. Then she turned to the path ahead. She stated that there was airflow with a low voice and looked vigilantly at the front. The protagonist also looked ahead and nodded in reply, grasping the sword in his hand tightly as a vague feeling of uneasiness heightened his guard. Hetty stated that the magic felt different, and they were probably close to the entrance, but there was some strange magic reaction in the front. She alerted everyone that they were close to the entrance of the secret chamber, and everyone became on guard. Knight Brian, who was walking with Lolly Girl at the front of the pack, seems to have sensed something, and reminded everyone to be alert. Unsheathing his steel broadsword, he casually brushed his other hand along the blade, and the blade was illuminated with a bright light. Then he told the 3 guard to guide the rear. Though the passageway was long, it was soon led to its end. Byron asked the lowly girl which way it was when a crossroad with a more open space appeared up ahead. This was the intersection of the tomb and the castle's underground system. It was also the center of the network of ancient hidden passageway. Lowly girl pointed to one of the path at the crossroad and stated that she came from that place, but it probably might have been occupied by a monster now. She told them the secret chamber leads to a well outside the castle, but it wouldn't be safe to go outside since monsters was roaming around. The protagonist looked at Hetty and questioned which road leads to the west, and that was the route he saw in his memory. Hetty drew a simple magic symbol in the air, and the symbol turned into a glowing ribbon. This glowing magic ribbon was blue in color. Then Hetty sent it off to look for the way leading to the west. The blue magic glow floated around before weaving and pointing to a certain direction on the passageway. The protagonist exclaims that it was over at the side. When he finished speaking, his voice fell and he suddenly sensed danger coming. His sense was very sharp as he stopped speaking due to the danger coming from an unknown direction. Before he could even give it a thought, his seasoning body had already reacted to the force coming towards him. The others were all shocked when they heard the loud sound. Hetty stood there looking at the protagonist while Betty bits her lips as though she could be frightened to tears at any time. The protagonist raised the sword of Pioneer in a parring motion, and he immediately felt shock through the sword as though he was hit by hammer. His body shook, but he steadied himself. Rebecca exclaimed immediately upon seeing the 3 monsters and shouted to the protagonist that those were the monsters they were speaking about. 3 swaying figures came walking out from one of the dark tunnels at the crossroad. Their bodies were made of mud like amorphous substance. At nearly 3 meters tall, the monsters were like shriveled and deformed giants put together using the dark art of the necromancers and warlock. Hetty raised her staff and stamped it on the ground, casting out a weak buff of clarity which lowered the effect of the fear the monster had inflicted on everyone. Hetty used a powerful purification magic on them so that they won't be affected by the monsters, and she also told them to stay calm. The protagonist, who had already recovered from the shock of his first encounter with this non-fumer muscle, questioned what this monster was. The mud-like substance undulated and bubbled on the surface of their bodies and occasionally exposed the red skeleton underneath. The 3 monsters had already launched their attack again. They were making murmuring sound as though they were talking in their sleep. One of the monster conjured a dark energy that condensed into an arrow in front of him, and in the next moment it flew straight for Lowly Girl, who was standing at the front of the group, and she cried out immediately. She shrunk back into the shadow behind Knight Byron, who raised his sword up as he got ready for battle. Lowly Girl appeared in another shadow 10 meters away, and Byron let out a roar and went forth to take on one of the incoming monsters. The protagonist shouted while swinging his sword, telling Hetty and Rebecca to take the monster that shoots the arrow and amber to protect the spellcaster. With a swing of his long sword, he boldly rushed forward. He had never wielded a sword to battle before, talk more of see any non-human monster either. Despite having gone through transmigration and resurrection, this was the first time he had set foot upon the soil of this other world. In that moment, he had absolutely no clue what he could do with the remnant fighting ability in this body. He cursed as he thought that this was just an aberration. 700 years ago, that Gawain Cecil could take on 100 of them single-handed. But now he was questioning if he could take on 3 of them. He still doesn't believe he could only take down 3. Fate had not left him in a circumstance for him to make his own choice, so he had to move on. Grasping the long saw tightly as he rushed toward the strange, fierce-looking monster, the blade swung and drew an arc in the air, slashing the body of the monster into 2. Sure enough, he was able to call upon Gawain Cecil abilities. He exhaled heavily from using so much energy, and this huge boost gave him confidence. Rebecca and Lowly Girl were surprised. The Lowly Girl stated that she didn't expect the protagonist to be quite strong after being dead for so long. Hetty was also surprised by the strength display of the ancestor. If it was any other person, they definitely won't show Sug's strength when they just got resurrected. Just as the protagonist was distracted, Hetty reminded him to be careful because a monster was trying to sneak attack him. A monster clawed at him just as he was being distracted. He turned over to see the monster hiding in the shadows. The protagonist used his sword to hold up the monster's claw tightly while saving much energy as possible and finding the monster's opening. These monsters were powerful and had a physical advantage, so the protagonist was likely in a disadvantage because of the monster's weight. Rebecca gathered her magic and drew an ancient ruin, which was an attack type ready to help in the fight. She gathered up her magic and created a huge-sized, scorching fireball from the front of her staff. She sent this fireball directly towards the monster attacking the protagonist, and when it got closer, the fireball collided in the air with the shadow arrow from the spellcasting monster, causing a shocking explosion. The mid-level knight was one of the top fighters in the Cecil territory. The three knights were also fighting out with a monster. Rebecca caught her breath and noticed Byron in danger, and she immediately shouted to the soldiers beside her to go and help Byron. One of the soldiers hesitated, but Rebecca shouted out that if Byron falls, it will be over for them, so she ordered them as the lady. The three soldiers had no choice but obey the order as they went toward where Byron was battling with a monster. They surrounded the monster and went into battle with Knight Byron against the terrifying monster. The protagonist was gradually immersing himself into the battle, and the memory and experience that did not belong to him was rapidly becoming his own. His ability was also improving, and this process gave him a new sense of accomplishment, and when he slowly recovered from his immersion, he had beat the monsters to pulp. The monster claw passed over the protagonist's head when he was distracted, and he ducks to the side, then sent a counterattack. He sent his long sword piercing into the opponent's thigh, which showed that the aberration covered in flowing mud was invulnerable and it could still be cut. The monster finally let out a murky howl, and its body fell uncontrollable to the side as it held its injured thigh, looking at the protagonist with cold eyes. The protagonist attacked again to determine the monster's weak point, which was the abdomen, the lower limbs, and the lower back. Taking this chance, the protagonist shouted to Byron to try attacking their abdomen and lower limbs and to not attack the chest since there is no heart. He told them that attacking the weak points can significantly weaken the fighting ability of those monstrosities. Getting pointers from the protagonist, Byron orders the other knight to hold it back so he could attack the monster's weak points. Byron's spirit rose, and he first attacked the monster's thigh, stabbing it with his long sword. Then he attacks the lower abdomen and lower limbs of the monster, which was struggling to break free from the restraint. One of the knight restraining the monster questioned if Knight Byron had got it as he grits his teeth and hold tightly. Byron smirked as he had a smile of victory on his face, preparing to finish the last attack and end the monster. Knight Byron gathered all his energy on his long sword and rushed to finish off the monster. But something unexpectedly happened. The monster stretched out its claws to attack Byron, who was rushing to kill it. Byron was stunned, but still continued forward, putting everything on the line with the claw of the monster piercing through his shoulder armor. Byron went under the monster crotch, which was slightly close to the last weak points of the monster. He struck and slashed at the monster as he knelt at the back of the monster, being restricted by the other knight. Then finally he landed the last strike on the lower back of the monster, which was one of its weakness. The monster fell and died right away, and its mud-like substance body started evaporating little by little. Even before the moment Byron defeated the monster, the protagonist had already killed the one he was fighting. Rebecca smiled and stated that it was all sorted out, and questioned if the protagonist was all right after the fight. The protagonist looked at the evaporating monster on the ground and emphasized that it was the monster attacking the Cecil territory. Everyone and everywhere became quiet as they all watched the monster they killed evaporating into thin air. Suddenly a purple shadow appeared amidst the evaporating air. These was a monster which hid among the shadow. Lowly Girl saw the shadow appear at the back of Rebecca, who was sitting down and resting from using too much energy in the fight. Suddenly Rebecca felt the aura and heard some little murmur from her back, and she knew a monster was there. But it was late to look back since she might not survive. Once the monster appeared in everyone's view, it wanted to attack Rebecca, but a dagger flew from the back and hit it on its lower back. It was none other than Lowly Girl Dagger. She rolled the dagger around her hand and stated that she was good at attacking the anus. Rebecca blushed and told her that the ancestor had told them that its weakness was its lower back, not the ass. Rebecca became angry seeing Lowly Girl not accepting her mistake, but even saying that she has got no sense of humor. Rebecca questioned if the protagonist knew where the monsters came from, and he asked if she knew the history of Gondorian Empire and the Second Founding. Rebecca smiled and looked at the protagonist, who was also looking at her, and answered that she knows that topic. Then she stated reading out the history of Gondorian Empire and the Second Founding, which was the most powerful empire 700 years ago, but it also caused the Dark Tide catastrophe. The protagonist smiled and praised Rebecca, stating that it was a good historian lesson which showed that there was something behind it. Hetty seems to feel that something wasn't right. The word of the protagonist had a meaning, so she asked him what he meant. When he heard the words of Hetty, he knew she understood him. He told them that the monster was the same he and the people from the Gondorian Empire fought 700 years ago. These monsters were born out of the demonic tide after the collapse of the empire back then. A monster like that came and hunted the remaining survivors. Even after the founding of a kingdom, the monsters did not stop coming, so he and his comrade had been fighting these monsters for the past 10 years of their existence. Rebecca questioned if after 10 years since the founding of the kingdom of Ansu, the monsters stopped attacking them. The protagonist smiled and patted her head, stating that it was after that did he die in the battlefield where the monster was flowing. As they walked through the passageway, the shadows of the people walking is illuminated at the wall by the side. Hetty questioned if the protagonist stated that the monsters that just appeared are the same with the one that appeared 700 years ago. The protagonist guessed they hadn't seen it for 100 years, and Hetty stated that the record of monsters started 600 years ago. Hetty looked down, dejected, and stated that those monsters had certainly been a nuisance in Ansu for a long time. However, ever since the elves' race built the towers, these monsters vanished and became nothing more than a legend. The protagonist thought about something and stated that the sentinel tower built by the elves are not something that could easily be destroyed. Rebecca called out to the protagonist and stated that the matter had to be reported to His Majesty the King as soon as possible. The protagonist waved his hands and stated confidently that the king won't spare any effort and immediately send people to rebuild their territory due to the influence of the Cecil family. Hetty was stunned, and her heart skipped. Then she called the protagonist and stated that she had something to say about the matter of the Cecil family. Seeing the downhearted look of Hetty, the protagonist knew that something wasn't right, so he questioned Hetty what was going on. Hetty, holding her staff, which shone green color, turned to look at Rebecca, who was also holding her staff, which shone orange mixed with red. Both of them looked down, not daring to look at the protagonist, as Hetty told him that the honor of the Cecil family was no more, although he was still the legendary founder of the kingdom. She stated that Rebecca now holds the family head title, but she was only a viscount, hearing that the protagonist grits his teeth angrily. Then he looked at them as though he was looking at ants and questioned what the descendants of the Cecil family did and asked if they assassinated the king or rebelled. Hetty didn't look happy as she told the protagonist that so many things had happened in the past 700 years. A.D. today, the Ansu kingdom belongs to the second dynasty, and the Cecil family, which was one of the founder of the Ansu kingdom, ceased being an important vassal of the frontier and became a stigmatized outcast of the royal family. Rebecca told the protagonist that 100 years ago, the last king of Ansu who had no heir died, leaving the kingdom in turmoil. The royal family with others fought for the throne. She stated that in fact that it was Marquis Grumman who was behind all this, and because he didn't have the support of his family, he turned his attention to his ancestor. The protagonist held his head, feeling annoyed, as he stated that it was these same Marquis Grumman that took his shield. Rebecca smiled and stated that he was right about Marquis Grumman being the one who took his shield and from there lost it. Marquis Grumman then imprisoned the then Grand Duke of the Cecil family and took that ancestor relic from the tomb in the name of the successor, and then proclaimed his support for Prince Tosh. The two people the Marquis Grumman supported died, and then he formed an alliance with one of the king's uncle. Then Duke of the North found a youth and claimed him to be the king's son. The North Grand Duke then used the youth as a leverage in the civil war, which ended in the misty moon of 636 in Ansu, and after the second dynasty of Ansu was established. Lollygirl interjected that the farce lasted only a year, but it caused a complete restructuring of the kingdom, leaving no one on the continent unaware of the history. They further told the protagonist that the last person to ascend to the throne was a bastard, known privately as the Bastard Prince of War. The Civil War involved many families except for the ones who jumped ship to support others, and there was no one better than Marquis Grumman for that. From then on, the Cecil family was left in ruins, although the last vestiges of the family lineage were preserved. The Cecil family now only exist in name. The protagonist hit the wall continuously and stated that it was a disgrace, a dishonor, and Grumman even lost his shield. He stated that nevertheless, looking back in the past won't help, as these monsters are a major threat to them. The city of St. Sunil might ignore them, but not the monsters. The protagonist looked ahead as he stated that for this reason, the St. Sunil must also value them who had survived the calamity. Rebecca was so happy that she exclaimed when she saw the exit to the secret chamber. Climbing up the stair, the root of the tree could be seen under the stairs, which seemed big. When they got outside, they all felt alive because of the gentle breeze. A huge tree can be seen, standing amidst the mountain and forest, and the passage was hidden under it. The protagonist looked at the sky and the sun he had not seen for a very long time, including when he was in the space. Everyone smiled and laughed. Hetty and Rebecca jested, while Betty looks around as though it was the first time seeing the amazing world. As for Lollygirl, she didn't even care. The protagonist, who was still looking at the sky, realized something very important. He looked at the luminary in the sky. Then he exclaimed that the huge ball on the sky that was even as big as Earth was not the sun, but just looks alike. This was the sunrise, but it was completely different from the one on Earth where the protagonist came from. And this is because of the relatively low luminous and thermal efficiency of the star here, and the close proximity of the planet to it. That is why a massive sun appears. Perhaps it is not a star at all, but an emitting beam of light and heat. Alternatively, it could be something less scientific, but something more magical and enigmatic. Perhaps the planet is not orbiting the sun, but is instead orbiting a gas giant as a satellite. Just then, Hetty interrupted his thoughts. Hetty called the protagonist, and he turns to look at her. He questioned why she called him, who was busy thinking about the weird sun. Hetty stated that he was lost in his thoughts, but first of all, they need to get out of there. It wasn't safe. The protagonist smiled and stated that first, they should check out the high ground to verify the situation in the vicinity. As they walked, the protagonist looked at the huge cliff in front of him and stated that all he knew was the topography of 700 years ago, which may not be useful today. One of the knight lead the way in the front, and the protagonist and the ladies were in the middle, and Byron and the other knight guided the back. As they walked, the protagonist continuously looked at the sun in the sky. He just couldn't get used to seeing such a huge sun after crossing. Rebecca was confused and questioned why the protagonist has been staring at the sun. She asked if there was a problem. Lowly Girl crossed her hand to her back as she smiled and stated that since the protagonist had slept for 700 years without seeing the sun, it was his first time seeing it for a while. Rebecca was annoyed and shouted that she didn't ask Lowly Girl. The protagonist's suspicion was cleared when he heard that the huge ball in the sky was also known as the sun. Just as he was looking, he saw a star that has been given a lot of symbolic meaning in religious and magical rituals. The protagonist looked at the shining star and stated that it was probably the star of this stellar system. Then they continued climbing up the mountain, walking toward the cliff to see the situation of the Cecil territory. When they got to the place, they all looked at the once glorious family being burned to crisp and emitting demonic energy floating to the cloud. Monstrous figure can be seen walking inside a Cecil family territory. There were too many of them looking for something to devour. The once glorious Cecil territory had turned into ruins. It was devoid of life, and the building had been destroyed. Nothing was left. Looking at these ruins, Rebecca couldn't help but tear up after seeing that the family domain had been destroyed. The protagonist stated that these was how the soil will look like when it has been corrupted by the tide, and soon new monsters will emerge from the soil endlessly. Lowly Girl was stunned and called the God of Shadows, questioning how they have been surrounded by those things before. Hetty looked at the protagonist and questioned if it was possible to remedy the land, and he told her that it was hopeless. The failure to stop the attack of the monster resulted in the formation of a colony whose resonance has created demonic tide. Even if all the monsters are eliminated, the contamination of the land will persist. And that will take a very long period of time, so Hetty asked how long it will take. But the protagonist instead questioned if human civilization returned to the land of the Gondorian Empire. Hetty replied that it was still a dead zone. No one dared to tread on the other side of the Great Barrier. The others at the back seems to have doubt on why the protagonist did not look angry, but dared not speak out. The protagonist did not know of their suspicion and stated that it would seem like the corruption of the Cecil family land would have lasted at least 700 years. After speaking, the protagonist realized that everywhere was quite no one was speaking. So he turned to Rebecca and questioned what was wrong. Rebecca, who was the most curious, couldn't help asking if the protagonist wasn't angry, because that was the last territory of the Cecil family. Then the protagonist realized that he had almost exposed himself. He cared, because naturally one should be angry that all their hard work was all in vain. Then he coughed and cleared his throat, thinking of what trick to use so that you will not look suspicious. He slowly stated that there was no use dwelling on what had happened. It was not like it could be reversed. Then the protagonist raised his hand up, putting up a hero pose, and stated that if the territory was gone, then it was gone. So they would have to find a new ground and start over. After hearing his word, all of them admired him, especially Rebecca, while the others were confused on what he meant. Lowly Girl thought that it was as expected of a legendary ancestor. His perspective and heart, we are really different. Although the protagonist was legendary, but still nowadays all the land is partitioned, so she was questioning where the protagonist would go. The protagonist stated that there was nothing more to see here, so it was time for them to plan their journey, finding a town first and then reunite with the other people. He believed it was a knight named Philip that led the other group to escape, so he asked if they agreed on a location to rendezvous. Rebecca took out a map and told him that they had agreed to meet on the northern town of Tanzanian. She spread the map on the ground and pointed at the place where Tanzanian was. Then she showed the protagonist the route. She stated that the Tanzanian was attacked by monsters, so they will continue north on the main road of the kingdom. So the protagonist agreed. Suddenly an accident happened. Everywhere started shaking, and the animals in the forest ran rampart as the leaf of the tree shook, showing that something dangerous was coming. Everyone became vigilant, and the protagonist held the sword on his waist. Knight Byron shouted for everyone to hide. Everyone spread to different places, looking for the best ways to hide and not get found out. The other 3 knights hide behind a tree, while the protagonist and Byron hide behind the rock. As for Betty, she was so frightened to call her mother. All of them looked up and saw a huge monster in sky, which roared very loudly, scaring all the other animals in the sky and land into hiding. Hetty was shocked when she saw the huge monster flying past she and Rebecca's head and exclaimed in fear. When the huge monster flew past them, it blew a huge wind in the land, sending her and Rebecca dress flying up and down and then suffocating them. The huge dark monster rushed toward the ruins of the Cecil family territory as its main target for coming out. Then the huge monster stopped in midair and then growled loudly as though it was the king of the sky. Indeed, it was the king that dominated the sky, the legendary dragon. It spit out a large fire and burned the ruins of the Cecil family. It continuously spread the fire from its mouth, burning every single thing from the ground, both the monsters. Looking down at its work which has been accomplished, the huge dragon flew away up the sky, leaving the ruined land. The protagonist came out from his hiding place and looked at the ruined territory of the Cecil family, which was still on fire. But what shocked them more was the dragon they saw in the sky. The legendary dragon had appeared in front of them. Rebecca had not come out from the trauma of seeing a dragon, as she trembled and stated that she just saw a dragon. Rebecca, who was still trembling, was startled when the protagonist stated that before she already say it, he also saw it. The protagonist looked at the land which had been destroyed by the tide together with the incinerated fire of the dragon. After careful looking and thought, he stated that the land has been completely lost. There was no remedy. A knight standing near Byron was still shocked, which Byron stated that he thought dragons only appeared in legend. The knight Byron looked at the protagonist and questioned if he had ever dealt with a dragon before, and the protagonist stated that he had not. He explained that dragons are very mysterious creatures, and even 700 years ago, when half of the continents of Lauren was being turned upside down, they did not interfere with the rest of the world. The protagonist questioned in doubt if the dragon really came from this world because its look more illustrative at close range. Just as he was admiring the dragon, a loud voice of exclamation can be heard from the back, so he turned to look. He saw the lowly girl running around, stating that the dragon was so big, and if she told her mom, she will not believe that she saw a dragon. The protagonist couldn't look on in this embarrassing scene, so he held her and told her it was all right because all of them also saw it. Then the protagonist remembered that she wasn't with them when the dragon came and asked her where she went. She replied that she hid in a crevice in a nearby rock and stated she was a good runner. The protagonist was speechless and stated that she was proud of the facts that she was the master of shadow, but still run. After, the protagonist told them that it was not safe there, so it was better for them to move on. Hearing what the protagonist said, Hetty's face regressed to sadness as she called him hesitated. She stated that the dragon had burned down their territory, so there was no place for them to move to. The protagonist replied that it was their ruin and monster that the dragon burnt, and the Cecil domain was already destroyed before it came. Hetty answered dejectedly, while the protagonist told her that it would be unrealistic to fight a dragon, so the best choice was to return to the civilization and report all the monsters and dragon. Even though Hetty had that, she was still not happy, but she had to listen to the ancestor. Then she cast out a magic spell. Looking at Hetty casting magic spell, the protagonist was happy and stated that magic was really a very convenient tool. When Hetty heard what he said, she questioned if she had upset him by using magic. The protagonist was delighted that they had a faster means to go back to the civilization and questioned why he should be upset. Then Hetty told him that the Cecil family had always been founded on the strength of the sword. 100 years ago, she and Rebecca would not have been accepted into the family because of this magic power. The protagonist was annoyed and questioned who had made such a stupid rule. Magic was a convenient tool for them. All of them were shocked and speechless, and Byron himself didn't even know what to say. They are ashamed to tell him. Then Rebecca mustered up her strength and pointed at him, indicating that the one who made the rule was he himself. Lowly Girl was also speechless, but just signed because she knew that the protagonist might have forgotten what he did. The protagonist himself remembered the night when he was drunk with his friend and said the stupid rule knights are better than mages. He was ashamed and turned to the other side, stating that they should pretend that there was no such rule when he was drunk. Lowly Girl interrupted them, stating that although it would be inappropriate to say something like this when he was having fun with his grandchildren, but she was hungry. The wind blew on the robe of the protagonist as he turned his attention to what the Lowly Girl just said. Then he called Betty, Hetty, and Rebecca, telling them to stay there, and Byron will be their guard. As for the others, they will go hunting with him. Then he caught hold of Lowly Girl, who was trying to sneak away, stating that she is also included in the hunting list. Lowly Girl started acting childish and flinging her hand as the protagonist held the back of her cloth. The protagonist questioned how she could say her ancestors were wood elf when she didn't want to follow him to hunt in the wood. Lowly Girl angrily stated that this was racial prejudice. No one stated that wood elves could only hunt in the wood because she herself learnt to stalk, not hunt, in the wood. Then the protagonist shamelessly reminded her that she had searched his tomb, catching her off guard. Then the Lowly Girl immediately calmed down and became obedient, answering affirmatively to the protagonist. Hetty and Rebecca sat down as Knight Byron and Betty went close to the forest to get some woods and set fire. Sitting quietly, Rebecca didn't know what else to do, so she decided to light up the wood and set fire. She gathered some fire in her hands, but soon it went out of control, growing large and larger, and these startled Rebecca and Hetty. Even Betty was scared. When Hetty saw that it was going out of hand, she gathered her magic and started soothing Rebecca fire magic. She concentrated the huge fire into a small fire and light the wood up while telling Rebecca it was all right. Hetty then turned to Rebecca, who was looking down, and told her not to be so easily embarrassed, and when she had to apologize, she shouldn't look down. As the heir of the Cecil family, she should be strong. Rebecca felt embarrassed and apologized to Hetty. Though Rebecca apologized, Hetty was still not happy. She frowned after remembering something Rebecca had done. Hetty sadly told Rebecca that her action today might have made the ancestor disappointed, although he did not show it. Rebecca was so anxious when she had heard Hetty's words, so she questioned what she should do. Hetty looked at Betty, who was getting more firewoods, and then looked around, then towards the woods. Hetty looked down, dejected, and stated that there was nothing they could do since their family had fallen from grace. Rebecca looked down and pouted after hearing Hetty's word. She was right, there were nothing now, and the family glory don't exist again. Suddenly she thought of something and came to a conclusion. She had been thinking about this particular thing for some while now. Hetty saw her expression and knew she was up to some unthinkable thing. She was caught off guard by her sudden quietness. The Rebecca looked up immediately and asked Hetty if she thought their ancestor had really come back to life. Hetty looked at her and questioned if Rebecca doubted her ancestor, who was the protagonist, or if she doubted his resurrection. Rebecca looked down as cold sweat dripped down from her face as she stated that she knew she shouldn't doubt the ancestor, but it was just unbelievable. Hetty looked away from Rebecca and placed her chin on her hand, stating that she also had doubt, but the truth was right in front of them. Then Hetty turned and questioned if Rebecca remembered the first lesson every student of magic learnt, which was not a theory or formula, but a motto. Hetty looked at the distance and read out the motto, which was the fact that truth may go against common sense, but truth will always be truth. And these hold true in areas other than magic as well, regardless of the origin of the ancestor resurrection. His resurrection is a truth. All four sat close to the bonfire, and Byron held a wood, placing it inside the bonfire. Just then the hunters came back carrying rabbits and wild boar, which was killed. Then they started roasting the hunted meats with the bonfire, and everyone sat around waiting. After sitting down on a rock, the protagonist started conversing with Lowly Girl, stating that she had said she didn't know hunting skill, but she was as skilled as a gray elf in Maso wood. Lowly Girl replied that his story of gray elves must at least be several centuries old, and told him that gray elves don't hunt anymore but are involved in herb dealings. She smiled and stated that she was not really a good hunter, although she was an half-elf who was raised in the human society by an old thief. Lowly Girl gave the protagonist some meat that was well cooked, and he collected it from her, asking what her skills were. She cringed her teeth and stated that although she didn't know how to hunt, but she at least know how to steal some chickens. Then she happily stated that she learned all those skills back when she was small, then continued chomping on her food. Just as she was done speaking, she was startled when Hetty stated that she was vulgar and unpleasant. Lowly Girl agreed that she was vulgar and a thief who can occasionally take few coins from passerby, unlike noble men who live in castles and have money to take out from their pocket. Hearing that, Byron, who was originally not at her back, appeared and swung his sword near her neck, scaring her out of her wit. The protagonist looked at the scared Loli and wondered how she managed not to get beaten to death with that mouth of hers. The protagonist smiled and emphasized that she must learn how to be a good fugitive. Loli girl, who was sitting on the ground, was in tears because of being targeted by everyone. She was quite miserable. But then her eyes lit up, and her eyes moved when the protagonist stated that it was enough of the jest. He stated that it was time to put aside the class struggles, as they are now on the same boat. First, they needed to restore their strength. The mage also need time to meditate to restore their mana. Then after that, they can leave before noon. They had already spent one night underground and can't afford to waste the rest of the day. Then Rebecca raised her hand and waved at Betty, telling her to come over at their side and have something to eat. She told Betty to put down the pan on her hand because she wouldn't need it anymore. Betty looked up and stared at Rebecca, not saying a single word, so no one knew if she was listening to Rebecca. She looked at her mistress Rebecca, then at the pan in her hand, as though in hesitation. The protagonist was a little curious, so he questioned why she kept holding the pan. Betty cringed her neck and stated that Madame Hansen told her she would be responsible for frying sausage and bread with the pan. The protagonist sighed and looked at the young lady with freckles on her face. Hetty cleared his doubt, telling him that Madame Hansen was in charge of the kitchen in the castle. Then she whispered to him that Madame Hansen had died back when the monster invaded the Cecil domain. The protagonist walked towards Betty and placed his hand on the top of her shoulder. He comforted her by emphasizing that the pan was hers and would be hers from then on. Then he told her that since it would be hers from then on, she could put it aside for a few minutes and go and eat. Seeing the protagonist comfort her, Hetty and Rebecca also looked at her and smiled, indicating that indeed the pan was hers. Knight Byron laughed out happily, and Loli Girl also smiled. Everyone had a happy look on their faces. Looking at the happy and smiling face of everyone, Betty knew she was not alone, and her spirit lifted. A nameless forest appeared right in front in this undeveloped region far from civilization. Nameless places like this were common. Walking through the forest, the protagonist's strong physical capability and all his innate qualities enabled him to easily survive in the wilderness. Hetty and Betty are the most who suffered because they had weak constitution, but Rebecca's performance was surprising. The protagonist complimented her, stating that her physical fitness was strong and no worse than a soldier. She explained that when she was young, she used to run around like a boy, and her father thought she could be a knight. Just then, Byron took out his sword and a blue lump appeared on it. Then he stated that there were magical beasts in the forest, but not clearly strong. The lump of blue substance slowly became transparent at the tip of the sword and gradually dissipated in the air. The center of the forest definitely should have a natural magical concentration of dark energy, although it would seem to be a very weak one. Loli Girl bent down and looked at the grass on the ground, stating that the magical beast must be weak. She continued speaking, saying that since there was no visible variation in the surrounding vegetables, it means that the level of concentration does not ever affect the wildlife. The protagonist looked at the two wilderness survival experts with a bit of surprise and stated that they seemed to have a real knowledge about wilderness. Rebecca smiled and stated that before serving her father, Knight Byron used to be a mercenary. Knight Byron was proud of this but still acted modest and spoke calmly, saying that it was in the past. Loli Girl, who was listening to the conversation, mocked Byron, stating that everyone also had a past. As they were talking, they already walked some distance toward the deeper forest. The surrounding trees were becoming denser, and the ray of light became sparse. Loli Girl's eyes flickered in alert. She asked if everyone felt that it was getting cold. Hetty became serious and raised her staff, stamping it forcefully on the ground. She started chanting a mouthful of hard-to-pronounce incantation, casting the detection spell. Betty's eyes widened in horror and she almost screamed out, but the protagonist stopped her. There were some white mist ghosts standing and watching the protagonist and the others. Hetty gritted her teeth and stated that the shadow in front was the mist wraith. Rebecca was slightly scared and questioned when they had gotten surrounded by those mist wraiths. Hetty became alert and questioned how something like the mist wraith appeared there. The protagonist already knew what the mist wraith was and told everyone to be quiet. He pulled out his sword of pioneers but had yet to launch any attack. Just as he searched for a thin section, a laughter sounded and he swung his sword in the direction. The protagonist shouted for them to set fire on the misty one before it reforms. The illusory image split into half by the protagonist did not vanish but started to form itself again. Realizing that the mist had its own consciousness, Hetty informed them of it. Rebecca's attack was much simpler. Fireballs of all sizes were sent flying towards the mist, causing explosions. The protagonist told her not to use fireball but to use a wide-range attack spell. But Rebecca yelled out that she could only use the fireball magic spell at the moment. The protagonist was startled and exclaimed what she meant in shock. Hetty told him that Rebecca had only learnt Fireball, and it took her 5 years to do so. Rebecca flushed red in the face, frustrated by her ineptitude in magic. Then she started chanting a wide-range spell with all her might. She gathered the powerful magic energy, almost using up every effort in order to shape it. Then, with a wave of her staff, the fireball of wash-basin size flew towards the densest part in the mist, causing an explosion. This sudden enlightenment before the battle resulted in a shocking turn of the tide. This extreme fireball caused an extreme explosion, and even the mist in front became thinner. Just then, one of the soldiers cried in fear and anger, and his eyes were blood red. The protagonist and others at the front turned and looked at the man, asking what was going on. Then he realized that the mist-wraith negative energy had finally utterly defeated the soldier's spirit. The other 2 soldiers swarmed up and pinned down the poor guy who had gone mad. Suddenly blood, like dark cloud, gathered in the eyes of the 2 soldiers, pinning the mad soldier down. They were also about to lose their mind, and the protagonist's thought was to wake them up. Seeing this, the protagonist immediately pierced his sword into the ground. Then he utilized the power that came from his body and used mind shock to wake the soldiers. The fear in the 2 soldiers' eyes quickly dissipated, and they regained conscience. But the poor guy in the ground had been broken in spirit by the mist wraith. The protagonist looked around and became tense, questioning where Betty was. Lowly Girl stated that she saw Betty running into the forest as though she was sleepwalking. Then the protagonist realized that Betty had lost control of her mind. The protagonist was surprised and questioned why the mist wraith situation was weird. Lowly Girl told him she didn't know what was weird about it, but it was already very bad. The mist wraith became spamming more ghosts again as though nothing happened. The protagonist logically stated that even if it was powerful, it should at least be weakened a little. He stated that they had previously determined that the magic concentration there was not powerful. Then he questioned why a mist wraith that even had intelligence spawned there. Lowly Girl was quick-witted and understood that he meant the mist didn't spawn naturally. The protagonist told her that it was not necessarily an artificial source, but something to sustain it. He emphasized that the thing sustaining it was nearby but hidden from their sense and invisible. Lowly Girl stated that Hetty had already used detection spell to check. Then her eyes widened as she suddenly thought that it might not be on the plane they were in. Before her words fell, the protagonist saw her suddenly jump backward and disappeared. Lowly Girl was jumping and shifting from surface to surface. After some time, she disappeared completely. The protagonist immediately knew it was Shadow Walk and questioned where Lowly came from. Before he could come out with more questions, Lowly Girl appeared again from his back. Just when the protagonist was about to ask the situation, she grabbed him and pulled him. He staggered for a moment, then felt himself passing through a layer of cold, illusory barrier. When his vision regained focus, the surroundings had already changed. The colors on everything were gone. It was only black and white everywhere. He looked around and noticed that the forest had disappeared, but there were dry tree stumps on the ground. Everyone, including Hetty, was standing not far from him, motionless, as if they were under spell. Then he grasped tightly the sword of pioneers and walked quickly towards the motionless statue. But just when he took half a step, Amber clutched his arm tightly. She appeared suddenly beside him and stopped him from going near them. She told him not to get too close because nothing could be done to help them at the moment. She told him not to ask any questions because of the change in her appearance. She told him they had limited time and it was her first time entering a deep part. The protagonist questioned what the place was, and she replied that it was the Shadow Realm. She stuck out her lips towards where Hetty and the others were and told the protagonist to look. The position where one of the soldiers had fallen to the ground turned into countless pale fragments. Rebecca and the others were normal, but beneath Betty's feet was a row of faintly glowing small footprints. The protagonist looked at the footprint and questioned if it was Betty's own. Lowly Girl stated that it looked like it, but she didn't know what happened when Betty entered the Shadow Realm. A simple conclusion led the protagonist to believe that Betty's footsteps would be their way to move forward. He looked at Hetty and the others, then walked forward following Betty's footsteps. Amber, who remembered the appearance of the forest, stated that perhaps the place was the true nature of the ghost mist. Then she told him that if they were to sell the discovery to secret society, they would gain a lot. The protagonist told her that they would give her portion and cast a spell on her and throw her into the Shadow Realm as scout. Lowly Girl stated that he was the founder of Ansu, so they can't fill their ancestor with portions. The protagonist scoffed and questioned what she thought would happen to him. He stated that they were happy to use him as ornament, and even the king himself gave him 3 days of every year, just for his reputation, and if they realized that he was alive, they would nail him back into the coffin. Lowly Girl asked why, and he stated that the 3 days of national holiday was gone. The protagonist almost fell headfirst to the ground when Lowly Girl told him it was only when they sacrificed to the king that they took 3 days off. Lowly Girl walked forward and told him not to oversell himself. But although he dispelled Lowly Girl's idea of selling information about the Shadow Realm, he was still curious. Both of them didn't walk far when a wooden house suddenly appeared in front of them. Climbing up, the door was closed, so Lowly Girl requested that the protagonist chop it up with his divine presence. Inside the house, a shadow hand turned into a normal flesh, as the owner knew he had a visitor. This old man stated that it had been a long time since he had a visitor in his lab talk, more of 2 of them. When the protagonist came in, he saw an unkempt man sitting behind a square table in the middle of the house. Then the protagonist told the old man they were looking for a 16-year-old girl carrying a pan. The old man told them to find somewhere to sit because a lady named Annie was preparing lunch. The protagonist asks instinctively on who Annie was. The old man smiled and explained that Annie was his daughter and a good girl. The protagonist and Lowly Girl were even more confused and stunned. The protagonist looked in a direction and saw Betty standing beside a small door. He heaved a breath of relief and stated that he was glad she was safe. However, Betty shook her head faintly, indicating that everything wasn't all right. The man behind the square table questioned if the launch was ready and should replies that it will be ready soon. The young lady turned around and went back to the kitchen. The protagonist and Lowly Girl exchanged looks, eyes filled with confusion. Confirming that the old man was not responding, the followed behind her. Betty was using her precious pan to cook sausage that were being fried and making sizzling sound. The protagonist and Lowly Girl spoke at the same time. He asks what was going on, while Amber exclaimed that she could cook in the Shadow Realm. From her demeanor, he could tell that she was not being put under spell like mind control. Betty's face was as confused as ever as she told them that the man outside treated her as his daughter. Lowly Girl's eyes widened, and she questioned why Betty took the man as her father obediently. Betty shook her head and stated that the man was pitiable, so she wanted to cook for him before leaving. Then the protagonist started thinking of the reason behind the old man's action. Betty called the protagonist and reached into her maidservant skirt's pocket. She took out a book and gave it to him, telling him that the old man gave it to her, but she didn't understand. The protagonist took the notebook and quickly flips through the last few pages of notes. Lowly Girl curiously leaned her head forward and saw that what was in the note was magic formula and ruin sequence. She looked confused at the complicated symbols and calculations, then stated that the strange man was a mage. The protagonist knocked Lowly Girl's head with the book and told her that the old man was not just a mage, but a wild mage. Then he questioned if she didn't see all the equipment outside when she walked through the door. And not only that, the old man must be more than a simple mage. In a murky space of half-light and shadows, the wild mage sat at the opposite end of the table eating. The protagonist was the first to break the silence and questioned how long the man had been there. The man put down his courtier and answered politely that he had been there since he left the secret society. The protagonist was surprised and questioned if he was a member of the secret society because he thought the man was a wild mage. The old man answered that by standard he could be considered a full-fledged spellcaster. The protagonist was even more surprised of how a full-fledged mage appeared in the Shadow Realm. The man explains that he was good at calculation but lacked ability to translate them into spell pattern. Even though he was originally the second-rank member of the secret society, he was not welcomed in the society. Amber was bewildered and questioned if they kicked him out from the society. The man shook his head and stated that he left of his own will. Then turning to Betty, he said he left for the sake of healing his daughter. The protagonist did not press the matter further. Instead, he stared into the man's eyes. Then he told the man that he knew exactly what they came there to do, and they didn't have much time to waste. The man stiffened and trembled, stating that he didn't understand what they meant. Betty looked at him a little anxious, and the protagonist frowned. After a moment, he moved his hand from his sword and told the man he would give him a moment. The man bowed his head and continued to eat his in silence. He ate a mouthful of sausage before cleaning up the vegetable stew in the soup bowl with his bread. He attempted to stand but was unsuccessful. In the end, Betty was the one who helped him up. She held the man by his elbow and told him she had to go off now. Then she shuffled over to the protagonist's side, stating that they were waiting for her. The wild mage's lip quivered, and at least he nodded gently. The man told Betty not to eat from strangers, to go to bed early and not fight with others. The light of reason faded from the poor man's eyes gradually. The poor man's body faded away slowly, but something that resembled a flame started to burn. The protagonist had been waiting for this moment. He knew the man was only talking gibberish. She unsheathed his sword of pioneer swiftly and pierced his sword through the man's chest. Everywhere started shaking, and the jar and plate on the table fell to the ground. Amber pulled Betty into her embrace quickly, and both of them were stunned by the scene in front of them. The fire in the mage body vibrated rapidly, and his transformation into an evil spirit was halted. The shadowy figure rapidly solidified before the flames consumed him, reducing him to a scorched corpse. It took half a minute before the body burnt into ashes and a cracked sound was heard from everywhere. After losing its master, the small wooden hut started disintegrating quickly. Dragging Amber Girl and Betty, the protagonist fled the house hastily. The moment they were outside, the entire hut crashed down. The three watched as the house crashed down into debris. The collapsed wooden hut caught fire as they watched. The flames only lasted for a short while, as if a paper house had been there instead of a wooden one. As the hut crumbled to ashes, Lowly Girl suddenly pointed at somewhere in the foundation of the hut. The protagonist stared intently, and beneath the ashes a shimmering light lit up. He stated that it was probably the mage's greatest achievements in his entire lifetime. He nodded his head slightly and told them that it was probably the spell that caused his fate. As he spoke, Betty's shadow begins to transform into floating pinpricks of light. The protagonist was startled by the sudden change of Betty. The pinpricks of light circled around twice before flying towards the protagonist and Lowly Girl. Lowly Girl told the protagonist that they had to flee because they were no longer welcome there. Then the protagonist glanced at the ruins and tugged Lowly Girl as he barked that they should go. In the real world, Rebecca and Hetty, who had spent their power, were supporting each other under a tree. Knight Byron was holding himself as he told Hetty that the fog had cleared, and she sighed in relief. Suddenly a friction occurred, and the protagonist appeared outside the real world. After Hetty saw him, she straightened up immediately and said it was glad he was safe. Then she spotted Amber behind the protagonist and questioned if she didn't flee. Lowly Girl immediately retorted that she and the protagonist went to save them in the Shadow Realm and called her big-breasted old woman. Hetty's expression turned sour, and she pointed at her, stating that she was insulting a member of nobility. The protagonist cut in and stated that it was Amber's fault for calling her a big-breasted old lady. Everyone present fell silent, and Hetty was the most embarrassed. Rebecca raised a timid hand and questioned if the protagonist had pardoned Amber for the sole positive things she said. Hearing what Rebecca said, Hetty looked like she had nothing to live for, while the protagonist broke out in cold sweat. Then Hetty questioned how the protagonist managed to get into the Shadow Realm. After listening to the story, Hetty stated that shadow walking skill can only be used by high-level shadow mage or God's heritage. She questioned how she managed to do it, and Lowly Girl told her that she was the chosen of gods of shadow. Hetty told her it was not possible because a god-chosen being cannot be slapped on the ground by Byron's ordinary sword. The protagonist cuts in and told Hetty to forget it and stop asking Amber questions. He told them he promised not to look into it, so when Amber wants to tell them, she will do so. Then he looked at the soldier's body on the ground and stated that they should first bury the dead. The protagonist stated that the soldier had put a brave fight and should be buried a warrior, but the two soldiers who survive were shocked. Looking at them, the protagonist was confused and questioned if he said anything wrong. Knight Byron walked over and told him the soldier was a serf, so he could not be buried as a warrior. The protagonist frowned and turned to look at Rebecca, questioning if it was so. Rebecca told him he gave them a chance to regain freedom. Then the protagonist took out a coin worth a manor and told them to bury the man. After the soldier was buried, the protagonist gave Hetty the old man's book, which explains how his daughter who was sick got a little better. But he didn't know why after all his treatments she got worse, and even the sun was laughing at him for his powerlessness. In the year 734, he discovered that something was wrong with the mana in the entire region. He realized he could no longer reverse the change in his daughter, and she started having weird dreams. In year 735, his daughter's debility reached its limit, and he had no choice but to choose another path to reach his goal. After preparation, he only needed to wait until midday sun comes, when mana was the strongest. The man stated that he will do anything to take his daughter to the Shadow Realm, and she won't suffer again. Hetty was about to close the book when the protagonist pointed at a corner, stating that there were still some words. The man said that the mana was out of control and the sun was red, which showed that he mistook it for a red sun. The old man seemed to come up with an insane idea of transforming both he and his daughter into shadow form. And the results led to a massive fire that happened 5 months ago, and the formation of the Wraith Mist. The protagonist interrupted Hetty suddenly, telling her that it was not the important part. The protagonist stated that what he wanted was the 2 details mentioned in the notebook. It was about the dark red pattern on the surface of the sun and the large-scale red spots eruption. In addition, the old man mentioned a surge in mana. As a mage, Hetty and Rebecca could sense that. Rebecca agrees there was a surge of mana in their domain, but she felt that mana surge was normal. Hetty stated that the frequency of mana surge in recent times had increased, but not at the alarming level. The protagonist mentioned that in Gondor 1736, a large, dark red pattern on the sun was reported from all over the empire. In the year 1738, they detected the largest red spot eruption, and almost half of the sun was covered with red spots. According to the records, almost a third of the babies born that day possessed innate elements affinity. There was a shortage of resonance stones in every newborn inspection bureau that day. The court of scholars thus declared that day the dawn of magic, but in that same year, something happened. The largest mana repository in the imperial capital exploded due to sudden appearance of chaotic mana inside the nexus. And in Gondor, year 1740, the mana tide erupted, and the most powerful human empire in history perished in a month. Rebecca stated in fear that if those monsters did not come from Gondor wasteland and were created naturally within the clan. Hetty completed her words for her, which meant that a new mana tide had began. Amber was the first to break the silence, stating that they might be overreacting a little. She stated that it was just a diary, and the protagonist agreed that they might be overreacting. Lowly Girl breathed a sigh of relief and stated that he had been dead for long, so his brain was still stuck at that period. Then she turned and said she knew the protagonist might have been traumatized due to the experience back then. Rebecca smacked her staff onto Lowly Girl's head and told her to mind her manners. The protagonist stated that no matter what the truth was, they had to report it to the king and see how much he believed. But the first thing to do was set up a foothold in the world. Even though the Cecil family had declined, it was much better. They thus made their way to the main road safely and even met a small caravan of traveling merchants. After handing them an adequate amount of money, which was done by Hetty, the crew finally put their worries of having to travel over hill and dale on foot. Lowly Girl smiled and stated that gold was the best business negotiator. The protagonist asked where the closest town was, and Hetty told him it was Tanza, which will take 7 days. Rebecca told him that Tanza was a new town more or less born from the immigration of the Cecil. Tanza was a very large town. It was one of the most populated towns in the south. Towards the east of the town is a mine, and the mine is the town's most important economic resource. While talking about the town, the caravan man informed them that they had arrived. The protagonist questioned if the Tanza had rules, and Hetty stated that those walking on either side are serfs and slaves. There are also poor freemen from the surrounding areas who are not allowed to use the road because they can't donate for maintenance. And even the clothes of the poor freemen were blank in themes of comparison. Those walking at the center are proper citizens, and they could afford the tax required to maintain the road. When Hetty saw the protagonist's face, she questioned if there was any problem, and he said it was nothing. As a person who crossed, he was repulsed by those things, but it was not time for him to correct it, simply because he didn't know the world yet, so he had to learn about it first. The protagonist asked the plan, and Hetty said she would contact the Lord of Tanza so he could contact Philip. The next matter was to decide their settlement, so that it will be necessary for Rebecca to gain audience with the king. And she would be able to explain everything in person, so the protagonist agreed. Then suddenly Amber spoke from the back, stating that she was back from scouting. Rebecca was dumbfounded and asked when she left. Lowly Girl told her it was when they entered Tanza. But instead of asking on Rebecca and Hetty were suspicious of her, Lowly Girl told them not to act like that because she went to scout by the protagonist order. She told them that Philip and the others were at Andrew's house and everywhere in the city Lord house was in lockdown. The protagonist told her to just say it if she was scared and to stop making excuse. Then he stated that it was good they were fine because with more manpower, the better the future. Walking toward Andrew's house, Hetty asked how they should introduce the protagonist, and he told them it was what they agreed earlier. After entering and sitting, the protagonist stated that there could be less discreet here. But Hetty hesitated and called the protagonist, and he answered. She asked if the presence of Amber, who was stealing, was appropriate there. Amber was startled when the protagonist called their name loudly. Now looking at the things on the table, spoons, plates, gold, and hairpin, they were speechless. It was now that they found on a pat-down of a sneaky thief. The protagonist tried calming himself down by saying that Amber was an important witness of his resurrection, and beside, if they rid themselves of her, it will be their own undoing. The attendant pushed open the large oak door, and a thin, tall man came walking into the room. Then he greeted Rebecca and Hetty, stating that he was sorry for being late. Then he started rambling on how the bad news in Cecil Domain had spread throughout his territory. The protagonist was speechless and questioned if he had to use the same tone as Andrew. Rebecca questioned if nobles at that time didn't do the same, and he stated that they were not, because he was from Earth. Hetty stood up and told Andrew that they understood that he was really busy. But she reminded him that Rebecca's title was Viscountess, not Miss. She told him that Rebecca inherited the title from her family, and Rebecca thanks him for his hospitality. Viscount Andrew raised her hand up and kisses it, stating that it was his pleasure. He said that he deeply regretted what happened in the Cecil family, but, was glad she was safe. Rebecca asked how Philip and the others were doing after a granted asylum.
Viscount Andrew told them he took care of them, and none had died from freezing or starvation.
Hearing what Viscount Andrew said, Rebecca breathes out in relief. The protagonist told him they would express their gratitude, but the priority was the disaster itself. Andrew stated that he has been curious on who the protagonist was. Then Hetty told him that the protagonist was the forefather of the Cecil family, Gawain Cecil. The protagonist was speechless by the title given to him and thought that the person who gave that name was an edgelord. Lord Andrew doubted, but Rebecca questioned why Hetty would lie of such things. The protagonist dropped his long sword of pioneer to the table. The protagonist asked why they would put on ancient costume and carry sword when they were facing disaster. The tide of monsters and elements destroyed a viscounty, and a dragon even appeared above them. He pushed the sword to Andrew and told him to ask elven craftsmen to verify the authenticity of the sword. He told Andrew he could also bring the portrait of the founding prince out and compare with him. Although he might have slept for 700 years, but his appearance had not changed. If possible, Andrew could seek elven mercenaries who participated in the second expansion operation. Viscount Andrew waved his hands and stated that it was not necessary. Andrew stated that since he was a hero, it was possible to sleep for 700 days before resurrection. But then he remembered something and asked if the protagonist said they saw a dragon. The protagonist answered affirmatively, saying that he had no clue where it came from, but it went northwest. Andrew's mind ran rampart as he thought of all the problems mentioned and questioned what was happening in their world. Hetty stated that their business was to pass information about what happened to the king as soon as possible. Andrew told them he had sent a messenger to report the news of the attack on the Cecil domain to the king. Hetty stated that it was not enough, and Rebecca had to meet the king in person. Andrew questioned what they needed and asked if it was horse, supplies, or guards. Rebecca answered that they needed all of them, from when they will return from the palace and find a new territory. Andrew stated that it was a matter of facts, and he was about to discuss the issue with them. He stated that he was just a mere viscount and was already trying to help his neighbor. Rebecca told him that Sir Philip brought a batch of gold and the money should be enough. Viscount Andrew looked shrewd and stated that he knew about the gold and silver. He told them he did not take advantage of them, but used the gold to treat and prepare food for them. But he looks directly at Rebecca and said that the gold was barely enough. But he would continue to help the refugees as much as possible. He simply wanted to make sure they would be able to pay for their debts. After saying that, Viscount Andrew continued sipping his tea. Everywhere and everyone became quiet, and no one can refuse what he said. Rebecca gained her confidence and stated that the Cecil family had the ability to repay the debt. She stated that as long as she was the heir and still there, the people's loan will always be a loan belonging to her family. Before she could say more, the protagonist interrupted her, telling her to calm down. The protagonist turned to Andrew and told him they should look at the bigger picture. Andrew smiled and politely apologized, stating that he was indeed a little greedy. The protagonist stated that he was at least honest and wanted to take care of his own interest. Then he recounted what happened, stating that the Monetide era had appeared again. And of course, after talking about morality, they still need to consider practical issues. Andrew was worried that the Cecil family would bring him loss, but the protagonist told him the family will bring him benefit. Andrew listened to the protagonist talk and told him to carry on. The protagonist slammed the table and told Andrew he could be his greatest asset. Andrew, who was still drinking his tea, spilled it all out when he heard the protagonist word. Andrew cleaned his face while telling the protagonist it was impossible, even though he was a founder. He stated that he was a viscount and had his people to consider. The protagonist told him to broaden his mind and asked if money and real estate were the only things that need investment. Andrew didn't understand what the protagonist meant and questioned what he meant. The protagonist told he had the external charter of pioneering. He, as Gawain Cecil, had the right to develop an unowned land, as long as it can be guaranteed to maintain a certain degree of control, and this development right was signed by the King Charles. And in fact, the decree was not signed to only him alone, but to the pioneering leaders. But he was the only one alive to exercise the decree. Those old geezers who signed with him would have never thought that one day he would come back to life. Rebecca timidly asked the protagonist if it was true, and he questioned who taught Rebecca history. Hetty told the protagonist that she was the one teaching Rebecca history, but she had a poor grade. Then she told the protagonist that the decree he mentioned had not been repealed. No one dared to abolish it. And not only had it not been abolished, but the historians and polymaths will write books about it. That meant his sudden resurrection will be a pleasant surprise to the people, and the decree finally came in handy. Andrew admitted that he had never thought of that before, and with that decree, the Cecil family might be revived. Then he questioned if the protagonist knew how many unowned lands are there on the border of the kingdom. The protagonist told him that his descendants had told him about that on the way there. Basically, all the habitable area has been distributed, and only the forest, poisonous swamps, and bordering lands remain. Andrew questioned what his plan was and where he planned to go and revive the Cecil family. The protagonist stated that it was a good question and he would think about it. A pioneering Grand Duke who participated in the second development and maintained the decree will be a great investment. Andrew stated that if his decree was recognized by the royal family, he would be happy to provide help with his ability. That was the typical of a sleek, aristocratic speech, leaving no flaws and showing a degree of courtesy. Rebecca questioned if it was possible that the current king won't recognize the decree. The protagonist stated that even if King Charles came out to be his witness, the king will pray that he will die on the spot. Rebecca angrily questioned why they will do that since he was the founder of Ansu. Amber stated that it was because the royal family and temple will set to lose 3 days of holiday. The protagonist smiled and told Rebecca not to listen to Amber's nonsense because it was a joke, he told. Then he turned and questioned if Hetty had figured out the real reason. Hetty told him that the king would honor the hero but not wish for him to come back, so as not to be under his control. The protagonist stated that the things he had to think about are basically certain now, and that is to put his eternal charter of pioneering decree into effect. In the space, a satellite had been rotating and moving towards a location. After some while, the location was established. Hetty questioned the protagonist if the Viscount's Andrew could be relied upon. The protagonist folds his hands to his chest and stated that he never even actually thought of that. Hetty told him that yet he discussed with him, and the protagonist told her he had to. He turned and looked at Hetty, stating that they had need of Andrew now. As for whether he was reliable or not, they didn't have any other options. At the side, Amber was listening and busy eating the apple she found. Rebecca asked Hetty if she thought Andrew would help the protagonist. Amber called her a silly girl and stated that Andrew will help for the sake of the benefits. Since Andrew took in the refugees naturally, he will want something from them, otherwise he could have just shot the gate and let the refugees perish. Although there are law of mutual aid, but in this remote place gold is worth much more than laws. Rebecca was confused and questioned how a thief like Lowly Girl knew so much. Amber stated that it was obvious that nobility mostly adept at advancing their own interest, and Rebecca was angry. Knowing that Rebecca won't be able to use her fireball in there, she told her to cast Ice Bolt if she can. Before she could finish speaking, her hand together with the grape she was holding were frozen by Hetty. Just then Betty came in through the door and told the protagonist that Philip was there. Then a young man walked into the room and called out to Rebecca and Hetty. He stated that it was good to see that they were safe and sound. Rebecca immediately smiled and Philip greeted her respectfully. She rushed towards him, stating that it was thanks to him that the soldiers and civilians were saved. The protagonist smiled and stated that Philip had done a good job and asked how many of their people survived. Philip seems to have already guessed the identity of the protagonist. The protagonist was startled when Hetty started praising him with many titles. The protagonist told her to stop because the titles gave him chill when he heard them. Philip knelt down and stated that the protagonist was the paragon of all night. The protagonist interrupted him before he could continue further and asked him to tell him how many people survived. Philip told him that when they broke out that day, they were more than 1,000, but later on they were only 900 because a lot perished. The protagonist asked him to tell him exactly how many people and who these people are. He told the protagonist that there were 873 people in total apart from him. Hetty smiled and complimented Philip for his hard work. He had done his best. Rebecca's body shook when she heard that they only had 873 people out of the hundreds of thousands. At the same time, in Viscount Andrew's chamber, a huge tower stood firmly. The Viscount was writing a secret letter to the king directly about the Cecil family condition. Because every nobleman in Ansu were the royal family direct vassals, so they had the right to communicate directly to the king. Andrew told the king all the situation happening in the Cecil family, including the fact that the protagonist had resurrected. After putting a special mark on the letter, he rolled it up and meticulously sealed it with wax. Then he told someone to send the letter to the Argent Citadel immediately, and it must arrive before the Cecils. That he told the person to go to the vault and return the gold and silver they collected from the Cecil family. Andrew was a cunning man, and since he had the largest asset, the protagonist, the silver and gold, was nothing to him. He didn't want to get on the bad side of the protagonist, so giving back everything was the first step. Viscount Andrew thought carefully and hopes that the protagonist from 700 years ago understood sincerity. As the day quickly turned to night, the protagonist stood at the balcony watching the stars and special celestial body. Amber's voice suddenly came from behind him. She stated that he always looks up to the sky every day. The protagonist told her that sneaking up onto someone else's balcony in the middle of the night was a bad manner. Suddenly, she blended into the shadows and appeared at the other side of the balcony. The protagonist was embarrassed to admit that he did get gossip bumps. Amber had questioned if he was scared of ghosts as a 700-year-old man. Lowly Girl stated that he always stared at the sun during the day and star during the night and asked what he was thinking. Instead of answering, the protagonist questioned what she thought was up in the sky. She questioned if he thought that the palace of gods might be up there, and told him that she was not interested in those gods. She stated that she worshipped the goddess of darkness, the Lady of Night, and didn't need a temple to do prayer every day. The protagonist questioned if she have ever had that once a person dies, he wanders in the sky. Amber asked with shining eyes if he went straight to heaven after he died and questioned what it was like after death. The protagonist told her that once a person dies, there was no memory of it. Lowly Girl snorted and stated that he was an old fart, which was very boring. The protagonist was annoyed and told her to repeat it again if she dared to, and she disappeared at the territory where the other Cecils that came along with Philip were staying. Rebecca walked to the place and felt heartache due to the injuries they had. None of them were sped of the injuries of facing the monsters, even though some were not injured physically, but mentally they had lost someone they care about. When the night all Rebecca, they all bowed and greeted her with respect. Then she turns to Philip, stating that the people will be on his care till she returns from the capital. Philip swore to take care of the people and the property in her name. Then the protagonist came from the back, telling Philip not to forget what he ordered him to do. He stated that Lord Andrew will provide the required assistant. He only simply needed to send those quick on their feet over. Philip questioned if the matter was really important, and the protagonist answered affirmatively. He told Philip that when the rumor got big, even the king won't be able to sit still and watch. Lowly Girl stated that the protagonist had started babbling about some bizarre high and mighty drivel again. Then they boarded the horse provided by Viscount Andrew. Betty, Byron, and Amber also tagged along. Before leaving, Hetty told Rebecca not to dishonor the name of the Cecil house and not rush to answer things she didn't know. But the most important thing was to always listen to her ancestor, especially when it comes to dealing with nobles. She told Rebecca that she wasn't good at that, but the ancestor was a Grand Duke and knows better. The protagonist thought of Rebecca's wildness and told her to not worry because he understood. The matured Hetty stayed behind to keep rein on the situation back in Tanzan Town, but she was worried about Rebecca. Then, Knight Philip selected some soldiers to go along with the protagonist and Rebecca to the capital. The protagonist allowed the group to stop at each town along the way. The protagonist stated that they would rest there for the day. The protagonist stated that they could not travel fast because they had other things to do. Then he told Byron to go and spread the news of his resurrection. The wider and further it travels, the better. Rebecca was confused and questioned what was going on. The protagonist stated that his goal was to spread news about his resurrection as far as possible. It could not stay as a secret among the nobility. It should be discussed by the civilians and perhaps serfs. If possible, he wanted it to be exaggerated into terrifying tale of monstrous proportion. And then everyone will know that he resurrected during the time when the kingdom was under siege by monsters. Then Byron galloped with his horse into the village, looking for a cafe to enter. Finally, he found one and entered, pretending to bring up the topic about the protagonist's resurrection. Even Amber, who was usually lazy, went to chat with some people and spread the news. The protagonist left and looked for an inn to stay, waiting for the news to spread. He placed a map on the table and looked at the locations and intersection of each of the town. Although the map drawing was of 10 years old to the satellite, but in this low-paced world, using a map of 10 years was not a problem. The protagonist stated that it seems like his plan was proceeding without a hitch. Then Amber jumped in from the window, telling the protagonist that the mission has been accomplished. She jumped down from the window's railing and walked to all the protagonist. Lowly Girl stated that he was looking at the map again and asked how many times he had done so. The protagonist stated that he was confirming the changes in the lay of the land between Cecil Domain and Royal City. Then he questioned how things were on her own end. Amber sat on a chair and stated that it had been almost 2 months now, and he was still worried about it. Then she took out a scroll and gave it to him, stating that it was the information gathered from the underground information broker. Be it the rogues, traveling merchants, or wandering bandits, all of them are on the word of him. There are about 100 versions of the use of his resurrection within the royal city, and no one will be surprised if he wanted to take the throne. In the royal city and in the royal palace, everywhere was splendid and pretty compared to the hut and bungalow in Tanzania. A scout told the king, who was sitting on the throne, that the proclaimed ancestor had arrived near the royal city, but they had not chosen to depart immediately. Instead, they continued to stay in a nearby town. The king calmly told the scout that he understood and he may leave. Then he touched the ring on his hand, stating that the protagonist sure is taking his time to travel to the royal city. His advisor by the side told the king he was afraid the protagonist had other motive for doing so. The king stated that he knew the protagonist was buying his time and drawing attention to increase his bargaining power. And in the past 2 months, the information about him are now over 100 of different versions and with different dialect. The advisor stated that through that method, they would not be able to fulfill the plan they discussed earlier. So now they can only do one thing, and that is to meeting the protagonist personally. Outside the palace, both nobles and normal civilians gathered near the street to see the legendary Gawain Cecil. The advisor told the king that the one entering the city was not the 17-year-old Viscountess of Cecil family, but the Duke of the South. The king told his advisor to treat the protagonist very well and accept all of his requests. The prince of the royal city standing by the side questioned his father if he thought the resurrected ancestor was fake or real. The king, with his composed demeanor, answered his son that it was not important. Although Andrew had sent him a letter and they received evidence, but whether the Grand Duke was real or not, they would have to see how things unfold. And as for now, he, the king, could only say that this was not a farce. Up in the sky, a blue flag, showing the symbol of the Duke of the Southern Realm, floated with the wind. The king stated that the protagonist sure give them a huge surprise. The prince looked down to see the protagonist and asked his father on what he thought the protagonist was there for. The king stated that before they meet, his intentions are all mere conjuncture, but he knew that the ancestor will definitely not present his intention for all to see. Subsequently, he instructed his offspring to seek out a favorable occasion to establish communication with the protagonist. The prince turned around and left after listening to his royal father's word. Then the king, who had been quite calm, called out a thing named Raven, telling it to go and monitor the protagonist and report any development. He reminded Raven not to get close to the protagonist because if he was the real legend, then it would be detected. Raven turned around and left to fulfill the king's order of monitoring the protagonist. The Cecil family, including the protagonist and the army, marched forward towards the palace. Rebecca was amazed and stunned by the beauty of the royal city, she exclaimed when she saw something interesting. An inviter came towards the protagonist and told him to follow him to the Argent Citadel because a good room and meal had been prepared for him. Then he told the protagonist that the meeting with the king was arranged for tomorrow so he could rest well today. The protagonist looked at the man and stated that he thought the king would be excited to meet him. After all, it was not easy to meet a person who just sprung out from the coffin. The man stated that the king considered the fatigue from his travel and arranged the meeting for tomorrow. The protagonist jokingly questioned if it was so. The man broke out in sweat as he had no other reason to tell the protagonist. The protagonist thanked the king for his grace, but stated that there was no need for him to enter the citadel. The man questioned where he would stay, and the protagonist stated that it was much comfortable staying at his place. But he wondered if number 4 Crown Street was still there or had been dismantled. The man was dumbfounded and repeated the name of the street. He seems to remember something. Then he told the protagonist that number 4 Crown Street was still there, but had been refurbished many times. The protagonist stated that it was a manor and won't be as sturdy as a castle. The protagonist stated that since it had been refurbished, it definitely was in good shape, so he would spend the night there. The protagonist stated that he knew it had been reclaimed by the royal family, but he just wanted to stay there since no one stayed there for 100 years. The man agreed that until now, no one had earned the right to inherit the house. The protagonist stated that since no one inherited it, there would be no problem for him to reside in his own house for a night. He turned around and started leaving while the man told him to wait so he could escort him. The protagonist rejected his idea and called Rebecca, who was still looking around, for them to go. Rebecca came near the protagonist and questioned if they weren't going to stay in the palace for the night. The protagonist stated that there was nothing nice about the palace and its foundation wasn't good. Then he told her to come so he could show her his house, which looked more proper. He told the man to inform the king that he would pay him a visit at the Argent Citadel, sharp at noontime. After the protagonist galloped further down the street with his horse, the man frowned. Then he turned and told the people behind him to send a druid that can transform into a bird to monitor the protagonist. At number 4 Crown Street, the protagonist's manner stood firmly and looked noble, like in themes of comparison. Some men were arranging the things in the house and carrying in the new luggage into the house. A man introduced himself as Thomas, the manager of the property, saying that he is honored to serve the protagonist during his stay royal palace. When the protagonist heard his name, he felt that it was familiar. and tried recollecting where he had it from. Finally, he remembered where he heard the name from. He questioned if he was Charlie's servant, and the name Bryant was bestowed by Charlie himself. The manager agreed, saying that his family has been the servants of the royal family, and the properties of the royal house in the royal city were all managed by his family. The protagonist continued, saying that his house were currently the property of the royal house, so there was no need for the manager to trouble himself. He threw his jacket and glove at the manager. He told him to relax because he won't be staying that long in his place. The manager immediately told the protagonist that he had received an order to serve him with their all and ensure that the manor is fit for his habitation. The protagonist pointed at the people outside pretending to be guides and told the manager to clear out those men selling tickets and acting as guide. The manager immediately led the protagonist and the lowly girl to their room as they passed by other chambers. Lowly girl could not help but be amazed by the environment and said that it is different from what she had thought. The protagonist told them that the place was built 700 years ago, and back then even the Argent Citadel was only a bit larger than this. Rebecca agreed, saying that she felt that the environment there is very nice while looking around with amazement and holding her staff. Aside from the large foundation, she remembers that the castle she had lived in isn't comparable to this place. But the lowly girl angrily told her that it was because her family fortunes were almost gone and resulted to them being poor. After she said that, the both of them started arguing. The protagonist immediately told them to stop arguing. He then told lowly girl that she should never pick a fight she could not escape, but she acted less concerned, saying that she won't fight. On getting to their destination, all of them stood and looked up ahead at what was presented in front of them in wonder. Looking at it, the protagonist gave a smile of joy, saying that they did preserve everything in the right way. He continued, saying that he won the axe presented there from Charlie in a swordsmanship duel. He continued, saying that the axe is not something great, whether as a weapon or any other thing, but it was just on dwarven axe. The protagonist also explained the axe, saying that it had large strength, and most human soldier wield the axe in each hand as if it was nothing. Rebecca, who was right beside the protagonist, asked if he was referring to the founder King Charlie. He stated that there was nobody else but him who could be called King Charlie after years, up till now. He continues, saying that Charlie he mentioned could only be one person, which is that King Charlie. The lowly girl asked if he insisted on coming to that place because he wants to take everything on the house back. She stated that his descendants have almost run his house into the ground, and he didn't get any chance to retrieve anything. The protagonist could not help but turn and asked her where she got the idea from, but she told him not to be shy because it was a normal idea. She also stated that the protagonist didn't need to worry about carrying anything and could leave it to her. And coupled with her abilities, it could only take 3 moving trips for her to clean the entire places of the items. But the protagonist told her to save it, because if he really wanted to take everything, he wouldn't need her help on doing so. Lowly girl told the protagonist that she noticed most of the stuff wasn't worth it because most of them were replicas and only the axe and vase are real. But the protagonist stopped her by telling her that the vase she felt is real must also be a replica too. Hearing what the protagonist said, she asked him why he dragged her there, because she was not a household client or a soldier, but just a passing thief. The protagonist stated that she was the one who tried to rob his grave, which is against the law. And secondly, he took notice of her strong ability not as a passing thief, but as an infiltrator. He stated that they were in the royal city, and there were probably many eyes on the place, and on each and every one of them. And Byron is a knight who's only strong at head-on combat. Rebecca only knows how to cast fireballs, and he hasn't fully recovered his strength. So he needs a skilled master of shadow at his disposal, after saying that the protagonist asked if she's satisfied. When the protagonist called her by her name, Amber was surprised and became speechless at the same time, not knowing how to react. She timidly scratched her face a little and told the protagonist that if he put it that way, then she would gladly help him. But he had to praise her more by calling her killing Master of Shadows a couple of more times, then she might not charge him. The protagonist turned to Rebecca, telling her to cast a fireball that is able to smash Amber's face without actually killing her. Manager Thomas came to the protagonist and told him that there was a guest from the royal palace while witnessing the 2 girls fighting. He continued informing the protagonist that Prince Edmund was paying him a visit any moment from now. Not long after Manager Thomas told the protagonist that the prince was visiting him, the prince arrived at the protagonist's place. The prince asked the protagonist if he was enjoying his stay, and if he was not enjoying it, he could inform Stuart Thomas. But the protagonist told him not to worry because there was nothing more comfortable than him living in his own home. He stated that they preserved the place because it looked identical to 700 years ago, and they're even reconstructed his favorite tea spot. The prince told him that maintaining a hero's residence is akin to protecting their royal family honor. But the protagonist told him that he might be dead for 700 years, but he was only 35 when he died, which was not much older than the prince. He stated that before, they were more straightforward, but today people need half-a-day pomp and circumstance before anything is started. The prince told the protagonist that his royal father thought that he would be hard to talk to. Amber stood at the corner listening to what the protagonist was saying to the prince with a smile on her face. The protagonist, on the other hand, told the prince that he would go straight to the point, also questioning if the prince was there to scope things. The protagonist stated that the reason the king sent the prince was to seek out what he wants after rising from his grave. But the prince told him that it was not his father's intention but his own because he is intrigued by the intention of the protagonist's visit. The prince questioned if the protagonist was at the royal family because of the benefits of a House Cecil. Immediately, the protagonist agreed, saying that he was there for the benefits of House Cecil, but the key point was which part. And from his point of view, there are many things he could ask for, most directly the hereditary dukedom and the southern domain. The prince told him that his descendants inherited his title, but as there ran afoul the kingdom laws, they were unable to retain their titles and holding. But the protagonist told him that if they were to go by the word of the law, his descendants can only fully inherit his title and holding after his death. And when he was alive, only his eldest son had the right to a noble rank below his, and is only limited to the exercise of legal authority. The prince was stunned and didn't say anything after hearing the protagonist's word. Amber stated that the protagonist was even more shameless than she is. The prince stated that when the laws were created, no one considered that he would come back to life. The protagonist stated that if he were to discuss the matter of Cecil House inheritance using the law, they are just too many loopholes. Although no one asked for laws of inheritance to revolve around him being dead or not. The prince sighs and stated that it was all right and he understands. The prince stated that the protagonist mentioned people if 709 years ago being straightforward, but now he felt that he was harder than his debate tutor. The protagonist stated that he did not only live through the savage times, but also the pinnacle of Gondor's glory, so they should not be looked down on. When they were barbaric, they drank blood, and when they were cultured, they could name a wine 36 times each name with a quarterson tied to it. The prince asked if they could talk in detail about what the protagonist and his father will discuss at noon tomorrow. Then the both of them toasted in silence and savored the red wine. After some while, the prince walked towards the entrance of the door leaving the building. Rebecca told him she thought it would be hard to deal with royals. Then the protagonist stated that it would not be hard for him to do so. He told her that the prince's behavior was opposite to what he showed them. He did his homework before coming over. The protagonist patted Rebecca's head because he knew she did not understand the two-faced human behavior. The prince first came as though to visit a noble lord's, then he noticed his behavior and how he spoke and quickly became easygoing and humorous, and that made the protagonist willing to talk with him. That itself showed the greatest ability of the prince. When the protagonist saw the confused look in Rebecca's face, he told her to stick to studying the 4-spell chant. Rebecca teared up and asked the protagonist if she was a little too dumb in that aspect of speaking with royals. The protagonist patted her head and stated that everyone had something they are good at, and there was no point of forcing it. The protagonist stated that, to be honest, he had little love for such intrigues. Raven watched as the protagonist told Rebecca he preferred the bunch back then when they threw caution to the wind as they fought for survival. In a classic room, everything seems blank with no shinning color. The protagonist opened the door and came into the simple dressed room. Then he looked at the desk in front of him with doubt. They seemed to be a square line showing that something was inside. The protagonist seems to know everything about the desk and subconsciously pressed a button under the desk. Then the desk creaked and opened, showing a small box inside the secret layer of the desk. When he opened the box, some crystals and a rune formula was inside. He thanked goodness that it was still there. The rune item was circle in shape with some strange, weird language and symbols written on it. The protagonist picked it up and exclaimed that he had gotten the key. Suddenly his mind alerted him of danger and he instinctively reacted. He draws out his long sword of pioneer and questioned who was there. A shadowy figure appeared at the other end of the room, stating that the acuity and reaction were familiar. Then the figure spoke calmly that it was him. These was a female with a vial closing half her face. Lowly Girl jumped out shouting that she finally got the thief. The lady was startled and reacted fast. She waved her hand and smacked Lowly Girl away. Lowly Girl smashed on the wall while the lady with a vial questioned what just happened. The protagonist raised his sword up, stating that if he was not wrong, the one the woman smacked on the wall was his guard. She apologized and stated that her method of appearance was ill-advised and questioned if he really wanted to fight her. She stated that for people like them, they would put half the city on alert if they were to fight. The protagonist didn't look flustered. Instead, he agreed that it would be better if the city was in alert. The lady knew that if she kept pushing further, the protagonist might really fight with her. The lady stated that there was no need to cause a commotion and cross sword with a legendary-level opponent. The lady respectfully stated that the Mithril Bank sends its regard to the protagonist. She introduced herself as Myletha Ponea, a VIP handler in charge of his deposit in the Mithril Bank. The protagonist felt that the name sounded weird, like a unicorn, as he thought of one. The lady was confused while the protagonist corrected himself, stating that it was a mispronunciation of calling her pony. Then the protagonist questioned what her purpose of coming in the night and even through a window was. The lady stated that many eyes were watching him and the top-level item he left behind, so they had to do everything in secrecy. The protagonist suddenly became very serious and questioned what he had deposited back then. The lady raised her hand and questioned if he had forgotten because he slept for too long. The protagonist could not actually remember that part of his memory, so he questioned if he could withdraw it, and the lady agreed. Then the lady raised her hand and mana flowed in it as she told the protagonist that he had paid a great price for such service then. Then a box appeared in her hand as she told him that the Mithril Bank encountered all sort of issues and are ready for eventualities. She told the protagonist that his memories was a minor problem, but if he placed his hand on the box, it could determine its owner. She told him that the ancient magic could be able to ascertain his identity. The protagonist placed his hand on the box nervously because he didn't know if the magic checks the soul of the person. To provide the most convenience to their customers was the motto of the Mithril Bank. She told him that his due had been paid 700 years ago, so she gave him the box of item. The protagonist collected and opened the box, seeing a crystal that looks familiar to him inside it. The protagonist was not stupid and questioned why she chose to visit him by these time and asked if it was part of the agreement. The lady disagreed and stated that it was because they had to ascertain the veracity of his resurrection. The lady stated that the price of logging in the capital was expensive, but she would waiver it for him since he was VIP. The protagonist told her that the price of grain in the capital was expensive and his foodie guard was injured by her, but he would waiver it. The lady took out a ring and gave it to him, stating that the transaction had been completed, and as VIP member, he would receive a gift. The protagonist collected the ring and questioned what it was. She told him it was a mithril ring, and every VIP who completed a mission gets it. She stated that he could use it to contact a VIP handler, but if it was just for nominal service, he could bring it to the nearest mithril bank. The protagonist stated that he hoped he won't have a reason to borrow money from again since the price of grain was expensive. A voice sounded in the room stating that sometimes unexpected things happen, so he would be welcomed one day as their customer. After the voice faded, the protagonist walked towards the window where the lady left from. The protagonist was shocked and startled when Amber appeared in front of him, stating that she just saw a thief. The protagonist's mind reacted quick as he could and smacked Amber away. Amber smashed on the wall again. After suffering from being smacked by the lady, she was smacked again by the protagonist. She felt despair and turned with the bruise on her face, questioning why, with a pitiful look. The protagonist questioned how he would have known she would suddenly come from the window instead of the door. She stated that she was a thief, so it was against her job to go through the door, and he didn't even talk about injury fee. The protagonist stated that he didn't have money now and would pay her once he would have them. Amber retorted that he was the one who said it. Then he told her to call Rebecca because he needed to see her for something. Amber questioned if the foundation of the Cecil family was actually inside the crystal on the table. The protagonist told her that if she stayed a little longer, he would smash her into the wall again, and this time with his sword. Amber humphed and left to complete the mission the protagonist gave her. The protagonist watched as she left while also thinking about something. Now he was thinking about the secret behind his resurrection, or he could call it possession. He had thought it was a coincidence that he was shot down to these world into the body of Gawain Cecil by the satellite. But now he realized that his coming there was a mistake, but Gawain Cecil resurrection was not. Now the most important thing he needed to understand was who he was. Just then, Rebecca came through the door and questioned if he was looking for her. Then the protagonist turned to Amber and told her to guard the door, and if anyone comes in, her pay will be forfeit. Amber was annoyed and retorted that it wasn't as though he had paid her before. Then she jumped outside through the window, and the protagonist questioned why she had to follow there. The protagonist stated that Amber was indeed not wrong, but he had something to tell Rebecca. Then he turned to her and stated that what he wanted to say was not about the division of inheritance. Rebecca looked at the item in the protagonist's hand and questioned what it was. The protagonist looked closely at the item and answered that it was a key and wanted to continue speaking when he was interrupted by Amber. Amber screamed out thief and stated that she had caught him again. Both the protagonist and Rebecca looked at each other and prepared for battle. What they waited for did not come. Instead, it was Amber dragging a man in black into the room. The man in black seems to be unconscious as he didn't react when Amber was dragging him. The protagonist was puzzled and questioned how she captured him. He asked if she subdued him in combat. Amber suspected that the protagonist thought she did something bad to the man and asked why he had that look. Amber stated that she might be weak in head-on combat but was strong when it comes to shadows. She told them that the man was showing his shadow step when she kicked him out. Rebecca bends down and checked the man's pulse while asking if the man was not gone for good. The protagonist stated that they would either be reduced to a bumbling fool or die. Suddenly the man moved around and frowned from the pain. Then he opened his eyes in confusion and exclaimed when he saw the protagonist and the others. The protagonist grabbed the man's cloth and started questioning who he was, why he came there, and who sent him. The man turned and saw Amber, who was having evil thought on how to interrogate him. Rebecca asked what she was stealing in the dungeon where she learned to interrogate, and she told her that she took some disposed items. The man was surprised when the protagonist removed his hand from his cloth. The protagonist told them that the man was a royal shadow guard among elites, and Amber can brag of capturing one for years. The protagonist questioned if the royal shadow guard had been reduced to just sneaking around after some years. The man was puzzled while the protagonist asked him if he wanted to know how he could tell. He slapped him and told him that he was the first trainer of the royal shadow guard. He created and named their version of training. Amber questioned how a knight like him taught people how to infiltrate others. The protagonist told Amber he trained them on the matter regarding physical abilities and dual-wielding sword. She asked why they need to be trained in dual-wielding sword technique, and he told her it was to take out all witnesses. He told them that for an infiltrator of Ansu, being detected while infiltrating was the true start if the mission. Looking at the man, the protagonist stated that it seems like the man didn't complete the training program. The man was shocked when he discovered that the protagonist was the one who made the hellish training. The protagonist asked if Francis LL was the one who sent him. The protagonist knew that the king was not stupid to let people assassinate him, so it was only for monitoring. Then the protagonist stated that the king should have reminded him to keep a distance from him. Then his eyes turned cold as he stared at the man sent to monitor him. He stated that even if the family had declined, he himself had not declined, so he asked if it was due to overconfidence or violation of order. The man turned his face to the side and stated that he had failed his duties, so he would pay with his life. The protagonist slapped his cheeks and called him a fool. He questioned if all of them had fallen to that state because time had been long, and asked the man what the duties of Shadow Guard was. He told the guard that his duty is to protect the people, the king, the land, and to fight evildoers plotting to turn the kingdom upside down. If he was an opposing person, he would have considered the man brave, but the man was at the founder's home trying to kill himself. The protagonist stated that he wasn't calculative enough to vent his anger on a junior, so he told the man to leave. The man questioned if the protagonist was sure to let him go. The protagonist stated that he could not kill the servant of Francis Lum in his place, nor does he want to take him to the Argent Citadel in front of everyone. The protagonist stated that although he would have loved to do so, but his days of willfulness had gone, so he had to let the man go. He stated that he had no intention of telling anyone what happened there that day, so whatever he reported was up to him. The man bowed respectfully and thanked the protagonist for letting him go. After thanking the protagonist, the man disappeared into the shadows in front of them. The protagonist placed his hands on his waist and stated that the man was yet another window walker. Rebecca moved closer and questioned if he really planned to let the man go. The protagonist turned and told Rebecca that he was indeed letting the man go. Then he told her that if she wanted to obtain greater benefits, she must cast her gaze further apace. There were two results of letting the man go, that is, if the king forget about the matter or let him be a disloyal guard. The opposite of loyalty is disloyalty, and there is truth in the word. Rebecca asked if the protagonist was treating the king as his enemy. He told her that it had not gotten to the point of being enemies, but he had to be cautious because this was the second dynasty. He stated that Cecil House might be part of the founding family, but they're still part of the previous dynasty. When Amber heard that, she didn't understand a single thing of what he said, but only to be cautious, as King Francis L must make consideration, and this consideration have made it necessary for him to be cautious. Rebecca stupidly questioned if he wants to pick a fight with the king. He told her he didn't want to pick a fight with the king but to cause trouble. The protagonist told him to forget the matter and focus on what they were doing. Rebecca told the protagonist he had said the item was a key to their family trove. Amber was surprised when she heard that it was a key to a secret trove. The protagonist stated that it was indeed a treasure trove and it was located in a secret vault in the south. Back then, the pioneer team escaped north from the Gondor Westlands and they gathered people and resources. It was when they passed the Mountain of Darkness that a large army of monsters roaming the wasteland discovered their trail. The army protected the civilians as they moved across the mountain, but a brutal battle took place and they suffered loose. After taking stock of their losses, Charlie and the protagonist realized that the monsters will come back. So they decided to keep part of the heavy wagons and hide them inside an abandoned fortress, then developed a seal upon the vault. And the seal was not just any simple one, but a powerful seal that will be hard to open. And the item with weird symbol was the key to the treasure vault. Rebecca questioned if they could use the treasure just like that. The protagonist stated that they could use it because they were his descendants. Those treasures were things buried by him and King Charlie, so since Charlie was gone, he was the best choice to inherit it. The protagonist stated that he didn't believe Charlie can pop out of his grave, as he did. Rebecca rushed to Amber and questioned if she didn't rob the royal tomb. Then Amber face blanked out as a question if the protagonist won't kill her because she had a top secret. The protagonist stated that if he wanted to, he would have done that, but he trusted Amber, and she was smart. At noon, in the Argent Citadel, a huge building like a temple stood high among the building in the city. A man and a lady walked towards the entrance of the Argent Citadel. The two walked into the large hall of Argent Citadel, escorted by some guards. The king was waiting for the two guests to enter and watched the door being opened. The guard opened the door and two shadows walked in. This two shadows was none other than the protagonist and Rebecca, who came to see the king. The king stood up from his throne and called out the name Gawain Cecil. He stated that he was representing the descendants of the Morn and of Pioneer to salute him as their ancient hero. The protagonist smiled at the king's word and continued walking forward. The protagonist stated that the last time so many people bowed to him, he was lying in his coffin. Everyone in the hall fell silent and were shocked and speechless. The king then said that it was common courtesy for the younger generation to pay respect to the older ones. The protagonist told the king that although his age is quite different, but he had the same expression as Charlie had when he was looking for excuse. Both of them laughed out. The resurrection of Gawain Cecil was real, and Francis, having the blood of House Morn flowing in him, was also real. A beautiful lady was standing by the side watching their interaction. This lady was Grand Duchess of the Northern Realm, Victoria Wilder. The protagonist told Victoria that she had the same stone face as her father, and he had once told him to look for a lively southern lass to even out that face of his. He looked at the others and stated that the descendants of Wider had suffered on his stead. They all looked poker face and none of them were smiling. The group were speechless. The king didn't understand much of what the protagonist was saying, so he didn't fought any word. Then the protagonist stated that the levity ends there, and it was time to get to business. He introduced Rebecca as his descendants, who will tell the king about the disaster that took place in the south. Then he told Rebecca to narrate the true problem they were facing. Rebecca told them that the Cecil land had been ruined by Dragonflame, and her people are starving and dying. She stated that they were forced to eke out a living under Lord Andrew's protection. She told them that the monsters that appeared was not just the dragon, but many monsters from the dark Mana Tide from 700 years ago. The king was shocked when he heard the Mana Tide. This was a story only few nobles knew about. Rebecca stated that the protagonist had lived through the destruction of the Empire of Gondal brought by the dark Mana Tide. The others were also shocked. Everyone knows that the dark Mana Tide took a lot of lives 700 years ago. Rebecca whispers to the protagonist, questioning if saying those words will convince the king. The protagonist stated that the world had enjoyed 700 years of peace, so it was time to give the younglings some time. Franklin told the protagonist that the matter was indeed unimaginable, and asked if it was the same monster he fought with 700 years ago. The protagonist told him that he had fought them teeth and nails for 20 years so he could recognize them even if it turns to dust. Duke Franklin was scared by the protagonist's confidence. The protagonist stated that if he didn't believe in him, he should send his people to check, and Franklin stated that he dare not. After all, it is pertaining to the dark Mana Tide, and no human kingdom could face the brunt of the tide head-on. Rebecca shouted out that the monsters killed her people, and she saw it with her own eyes. The protagonist looked at her and remembered what Hetty had said, so he told her to calm down. Duke Franklin stated that they needed something much more tangible and a proof, not just words. The protagonist's eyes turned cold, and he questioned if they wanted proof. Then he threw the sword he had been holding onto since he came in up. It stabbed right into the ground in front of the Franklin, and he was startled. The protagonist told them that the sword was the proof they seek. When they checked it, they saw that it had been corroded by dark mana-tide aura. Just then, 2 soldiers carried a heavy box into the hall and walked in front of everyone. Then they poured out the helmet and weapon inside it to the ground. The king was startled and questioned why there were arms and armor. The protagonist told the king that this were the equipment his warriors were using in the southern realm. Every pieces of armor and every blade there represented brave souls that fought an enemy on the dark mana-tide with all their might. The king was stumped for words and didn't say anything. The protagonist stated that if their royal historians were not completely useless, then the records will mention the tide. The king answered that the library did mention something about the dark mana-tide. Victoria questioned if the protagonist knew where the dragon headed to. The protagonist told her that he didn't know where the dragon went to. Victoria stated that 3 months ago rumors spread that a dragon appeared in her kingdom, but nothing came out of that. The king stated that they needed to investigate the matter before coming to a conclusion. Rebecca stated that not only must they investigate, they must also prepare for war. Duke Laurent questioned if she knew what war was and asked how they should wait for monsters nobody knew when they would come. Rebecca stated that it would be for the better. Laurent stated that it would be impossible because the local nobility will revolt. Then Laurent spoke out they couldn't send out their warriors, and because of his greed he overlooked a lot of things. Victoria told the protagonist they would certainly take his word serious, and if there is news he will be informed. Rebecca wanted to say more, but the protagonist stopped her. He told her that this was the only way. There was nothing else to say. They had already brought words there. As for what follows after, it was up to them. But now it was time to talk to the king about the private matter of the house Cecil. Everyone immediately became quiet as they thought of something. He told them to relax, that he didn't want to climb out of his coffin and demand his due from the ungrateful them. He picked his sword from the ground and stated that he knew what happened 100 years ago. He told them that, to be frank, he wanted to choke the inept descendants of his, so he had no interest but to reclaim what belonged to him. The king and the Lady Victoria were confused on what he meant by his belonging. He told them not to worry because his descendants already collected those. What he referred to is a part that cannot be inherited, which was his pioneering right. They were all shocked when they had that.
Minister Alfred questioned which land he plans to develop since the others had been occupied.
The protagonist knew this would happen, so he told them it was the Mountain of Darkness. The king told him that the place was connected to the Gondor wasteland and borders the Typhoon Empire. The protagonist stated that he may not be adept, as they were in terms of political sparring and intrigues, but when it came to facing the perils of nature, none of them can beat him. The king was confused and questioned what the protagonist meant to say. The protagonist repeated his word that he wanted the Mountain of Darkness. In the Mountain of Darkness, it was just as its name, filled with danger everywhere. Dead corpse could be seen everywhere around the mountain. A bird was busy peeking on a human corpse. It peeked out the human eyeball and stood up right when it had a noise. Then suddenly its eyes seemed to have seen something from the distance. Then the tiny bird turned into a huge, weird monster. That was the reason why the place was dangerous. Recalling the fearful monsters in the Mountain of Darkness, the king broke out in sweat. Everyone were already sitting in order to discuss the matter regarding the decree. The king looked at the protagonist and asked if he was sure he wanted to take the Mountain of Darkness. The protagonist looked calmly and even had a smile on his face as he told the king he really wanted the land. The 2 handmen of the king told him to see the protagonist off, since he was the one who made the request. The others were also gossiping, stating that the protagonist had not fully woken up from his slumber yet. The 2 handmen of the king told him that it was an opportunity to send the protagonist farther from the royal city. The king was finally persuaded and swiftly collected the stamp of royal and raised it up. Then he loudly stamped the royal seal on the document. Then he rolled the document up and gave it to the protagonist, telling him he was done. Leaving the palace, the protagonist opened the document to see. The protagonist was still looking at the seal stamp of royal on the document. Andrew told the protagonist to pardon his bluntness and stated that he was afraid the spot he chose was unsuitable. Unclean wind blow every Brumaire, and the serf and civilians will have no way to fight against the beast in the mountain. The protagonist stated that the unclean wind can be warded using poultice and magic. He stated that they would be able to stand on their own as long as they lived through the year first. Andrew stated that he respected his decision, but he should remember their initial agreement. The protagonist stated that the Cecil house will never forget the debt. The protagonist suggested to give one or two of the antiques as security, and Andrew was confused. Rebecca was excited when she heard the protagonist word, while Hetty was speechless of Rebecca's behavior. Andrew stated that he trusted the founding hero's credibility and questioned when the protagonist planned to depart. The protagonist told him the sooner the better as he mounted his horse. The Viscount Andrew then told the protagonist to excuse him and continue his journey. Then the protagonist called Rebecca, and she answered him. He told her he wanted her to do a census, grouping the population by family name. Then she would need another independent list showing their skill. Both Rebecca and Hetty were confused on what serial number and census was. Both were stunned when the protagonist asked if they had never done census before. Rebecca stated that Hetty was in charge of everything within the castle. The protagonist was shocked when he found out they were ruling by mood swing. Hetty questioned if he and the king used that method to calculate population then. The protagonist remembered when Charlie called him and told him his maths was awesome. Now he realized that Charlie was ruling by mood swing and on whims. The protagonist stated that if it was 700 years ago, things should change now. The protagonist questioned why they had not made any improvement at all after 700 years. Both the ladies ran away with speed to do the census ordered by the protagonist. The protagonist stated that they would depart once their provisions and supplies are ready. Then they galloped and left for the Mountain of Darkness. As they walked, they saw little birds in their nest on a tree watching them. The soldiers were already getting tired and swayed time after time. They traveled over hills and even walked through some rivers. The protagonist was leading in the front while Hetty was at the side. They all continued galloping forward with their horse through the river. Hetty stated that it seems like they had become pioneers in history tomes. The protagonist smiled and stated that they are pioneers. Hetty stated that she meant the Great Reclamation 700 years ago. He told her to have confidence because every time they step into the unknown, that itself is a great journey. He told her that each endeavor was equally great. And they are about to do the same thing as the ancient ones. And perhaps they might even build a new age, a new world rule. Amber, who was sitting in a moving caravan, stated then the protagonist was right. The protagonist laughed out when Amber told others to give him a round of applause. Soon the group got to the Mountain of Darkness. Hetty questioned if he was sure of what he wanted to do. The protagonist stated that he was going to retake his inheritance. At another place, a woman in all white stood in front of a portrait. This woman was Lady Victoria, who just spoke together with the protagonist in the palace. A dark female, wearing all black, told Lady Victoria she looked tired. Lady Victoria stated that the founding duke had been really resurrected, and she is afraid the king will become even more disobedient from then on. Lady Victoria stated that what she wanted was Ansu Kingdom property, not power. Then she told Maki, the dark girl, to take down Lord Cecil's portrait. After all, hanging a portrait of a living person isn't appropriate. In the Mountain of Darkness, some shadows could be seen walking through. A slash was made and some grass were ripped off the road. The protagonist and his companion were looking at the forest surrounding as they passed. Amber stated that the lineup was small because they are treasure hunting in a dangerous place. The protagonist stated that it was dangerous, but most mutant monsters rely on the chaotic mana to survive. And so the northern side they came from was safe for now. When they reached a place, the protagonist told Rebecca to use her fireball. She immediately activated and gathered her fireball, exploding the ground. A huge hole was made and they all entered to see a vault in front. Rebecca and Amber exclaimed when they saw the huge door. Byron raised his hands to his head to see the size of the door. Right close to the vault was a sword embedded in the ground for years. The protagonist walked close to the sword and held the handle. The protagonist knelt down and Rebecca questioned what was going on. Holding the sword, the protagonist thought of many things. His face turned cold. He closed his eyes and thought of the war and death that appeared. That day the people fought very hard with the monsters. But not everyone was able to get up after the war. 16th Company Care lays there in eternal rest. He told Byron that this place was the place they were in charge as rear guards during the crossing of the Whitewater River. They were unable to break through and had to retreat there. It was a pity. The mana tide raged on, and he was unable to retake the area while he was still alive. By the time the mana tide receded by itself, no one remembered these places. He told them to follow him, and he would take them to have a look and see what their ancestors left behind. Then he opened the vault, and they all walked into it. Amber asked if there was any ancient magical monster from some other dimension or magic traps there. The protagonist told her she was a grave robber and was afraid of a 1,000-years-old ancient facility. Amber told him it was different because no one knows what will pop out from the ancient facility. The protagonist told her he was still just a person after coming back to life and was sorry to disappoint her. Right in front of them, a door appeared at the other end of the passage. This door was created with a very strong steel, a rare one. Amber exclaimed and questioned if what she saw was an entire slab of violet steel. The protagonist told her to take whatever crazy ideas she had off her mind. And for her to wait for him to pay her salary, Amber called him a stingy old coot. She was still leaning on the door when the protagonist activated it. The door to the treasury opened and was as big as a palace door. The protagonist told them to come into the treasury. Then he used the magic aegis of gentle wind while Amber was a relentless person. She was busy trying hard with her dagger to scrap out pieces of violet steel, but instead her dagger bent. Inside the vault, the first thing clear to see was the gold and batch of money. Everywhere around had gold and some steel-locked box. Rebecca and Amber, who had not seen such quantity of money, lay on it. The protagonist used his sword to open one of the box. He picked up a crystal and told them that it was the most valuable thing there. The crystal was imbued with low-level barrier and explosion magic. It was unbelievably an advanced weapon. Rebecca and Amber rushed from where and lay on the crystal, stating that they were rich. Byron was surprised that such riches lay silently on the border of the kingdom without anyone knowing. Rebecca stated that with the money they can pay off their debt and get other things. The protagonist stated that they could not use the money directly. If they took a coin of 700 years ago to business, fools can tell they're struck gold. Rebecca questioned what they should do since they were in dire need of money. The protagonist stated that they needed to melt the antique down and turn them into bullion, or ansu coin. Amber stated that the coin are 700 years old antique. The protagonist agreed and told them they were only going to melt a small portion to ease their more pressing need. Amber started pouring the gold on her body, stating that they were rich. The protagonist picked her up from the gold coin and told her to calm down. He told her that the money was not hers but his. Plus, when compared to the future, this treasure trove was nothing. The future, everyone started thinking about how the future will be. Amber sat on a hill watching the preparation done by the people down. The people were busy making tent and taking care of some cardboard. All the properties they brought when they came was laid on the ground. The protagonist walks to Het and told her he had something to tell her. He told her to look at the people working there. Instead of focusing and completing their job, they were busy boasting. Hetty was surprised and didn't know what to say about it. She apologized to the protagonist, stating that it was her responsibility. The protagonist told her that it was not her problem, but those people attitude. Rebecca and Hetty became silent after seeing that the protagonist was not happy. Rebecca told the protagonist he could not ask much from the civilians and serfs. The protagonist slammed his hand on the table and questioned if building a tent wasn't so complicated. Hetty stated that only military soldiers were strict with encampment, and the civilians and serf would never be able to do it. The protagonist stated that it was not complicated to build a tent. He questioned if they thought the civilians and serf were too foolish that they aren't able to master such thing. He told them that while they was still daylight, they should gather everyone together. He said heard that Gawain Cecil, will be enacting new laws. Outside the tent, when the sun set, everyone gathered together. A hand opened up the curtain of the tent, and the protagonist walked out dressed in new clothes. The protagonist looked at the people gathered around the tent. Hetty told him that his people were waiting for him. Then he climbed on top of a desk so that the people could see him. Then he shouted out to the people of the Cecil domain. He stated that he knew. All of them knows who he is, so no more introduction. Then he stated that all of them should know that his word can act as Cecil's law, and while the law can give them protection, it demands their obedience. The protagonist stated that they were developing a new domain, but firstly that the old domain was gone and every bit of wealth had passed with it. He stated that in his name, every doubt that relates to House Cecil shall be forgiven. The people were stunned and questioned if it meant they won't pay any longer. Rebecca was surprised and called the protagonist to be sure. He told them that secondly, all serf had a chance to gain freedom, and that is true labor. This surprised not only the people, but even Rebecca, Hetty, and Byron. The people doubted what the protagonist said. He continues speaking, stating that they will build fence and camps that day, and if they completed it, they would have meat to eat. The people were surprised to hear that they would have meat to eat if the mangas completed their work. Even before the protagonist finished speaking, the people dispersed to continue their work. Hetty questioned if the protagonist meant what he said. She said that if they go by his intention, there will no longer be any sarf on the Cecil domain. The protagonist questioned what she thought was wrong. Rebecca stated that she didn't feel that it was wrong to abolish the serfdom. Her father told her that a serf will grow lazy without a whip, but whipping is not the best solution. The protagonist smiled and stated that she had good insight. Hetty and Rebecca laughed when they heard the compliment of the protagonist. Amber stated that she did not expect the protagonist to have a generous side. Instead, the protagonist stated that all of them had read the history tomes and known how the powerful empire of Gondor was. Amber stated that it was due to the dark mana tide. The protagonist told them he had a feeling the mana tide will be up on them soon. Then the protagonist pointed it somewhere and told Amber to look over. He had no intention to joke at all. The monsters were his nemesis 700 years ago. History was just like a mirror, and he had seen what hell looked like. He had seen empires far more powerful. The upper-class masters of magic sat inside the castle watching the fireworks. In the face of the mana tide, the empires was vulnerable. In the face of the mana tide, everyone was the same. In the face of the mana tide, there was no freedom nor servitude. So they needed to change all of that, not just serfdom and not just for themselves, but for all the life in this world. It won't do them any good if they are left out. Hetty whispers that the protagonist had a daring spirit of a pioneer from 700 years ago. The protagonist told them that a backward age of ignorance will find it difficult to escape the shackles of gravity, with no right to even look up, much less the future and vast stars above that await their unraveling their secrets. On the table, a map was showing the intersection of each place in the mountain of darkness. Byron entered to see the protagonist staring at the map. Byron questioned if they needed 10 persons' portions of meat, because even if it was the size of walnut, everyone will be happy. The protagonist told him to let the chef do the preparation of the food right in front of them. Byron stated that he was not quite sure of what the protagonist's intention were. The protagonist asked Amber if he were to ask her to paint a wall with no payment, what was she to do? She told him that she would first steal from him and then hire someone to draw the wall and use the rest of the money for booze. The protagonist stated that it was his folly to try to talk sense with a disgrace of a creation like Amber. Before Amber could restore it, Hetty came rushing in, calling the protagonist. Hetty told the protagonist the people had completed their task quickly and efficiently. The protagonist told her she just needed to trust him on that and asked her to come and look at something. There were some document books on the desk, and Hetty asked her what it was. He told her it was something the Gondor Empire lacked during their days. Amber questioned if all the pioneers were monsters in the art. He told her that the pioneers then could draw a map of a kingdom with closed eyes. The protagonist questions in his mind when the production of ballpoint pen would start, since the quail was a pain to write with. Outside, the civilian serf and slaves were all working hard in order to earn some meat to eat. Hetty watched and stated that she had never seen such a scene of labor before. As she stood there watching, some men passing by told her that it was work hour time, and even smiled, telling her to make way for them so they could continue. Hetty smiled and shifted for them to pass by. Just by ensuring that their team had meat in their meal, their enthusiasm and efficiency has become beyond belief. The men moved the wood to the riverside and used it to build some easy sailing boats. Just as they started rowing the boat, one of them told the other to be careful because the wood was coming apart. Then the rope used to tie the wood together cut it, immediately after he finished speaking. Before the man could do anything, a magical water hand appeared in front of him. The hand then held together the woods that wanted to separate. One of them pointed at the land, stating that it was Lady Hetty. She was the one helping them. Hetty gathered her magic power and mended the woods together. Then she helped them push the wood boat a little farther into the river. The two on the boat thanked Hetty and she smiled at them. She was startled when someone spoke from the back, stating that magic was very convenient. Then her leg slipped from the land and she almost fell to the ground. The person told her to be careful and caught her hand, drawing her back. When she turned back, it was the ancestor. She apologized for not realizing he was standing behind her. The protagonist told her that her skill wasn't half bad, and she started that she was not particularly gifted in the arcane. She also told the protagonist Rebecca could only master fireball because she was not that particularly talented. But in fact, Rebecca was a very hard-working child. But there was no helping it. The limitation of one's talent is a limitation. Rebecca can only strengthen basic level spell like the fireball. But her situation was actually very common. Their ability to create magic models cannot catch up to their theocratical standard, so they can only be low-level mage for the rest of their lives. The protagonist looked at her and stated that she was wrong. He told her that he had sent someone to Tanza, and when the convoy arrived, she would build her magic experimentation chamber. The protagonist told her he had taken a few mithril out of the vault, enough to get her a set of basic equipment. Hetty stated that she understood and will see to the imprint of the runic structure diagram he requested. At the other side, Rebecca was eating bun and whistling some music as the civilian followed her. But as for Amber, the lass was busy sleeping on the desk filled with crystal stone. The protagonist came into the room and picked up a crystal stone. He then looked at the silly Amber who was snoring while sleeping. The protagonist picked up Amber with one hand and held a crystal stone with the other hand. Amber was shaken by the protagonist, who questioned if that was how she stood guard. Amber finally woke up from her stupor and told the protagonist that he had scared her into thinking that an earthquake was happening. The protagonist raised a paper up and said that she drolled on it, and she replied that no one had control of such thing. Then she stated that he was still drawing the weird picture again, and he answered that it was the plan, laws, and construction plans. After looking at it, she stated that she didn't understand. Then the protagonist told her it was upside down. She then changed her words, saying that she had never seen diagram like that before and they were hard to understand. The protagonist told her it was the reason she needed to study, so she should go and learn from Rebecca or Hetty. Then she stated that she didn't like dealing with nobles, but the protagonist told her he was a noble. She told the protagonist he didn't act like a noble, and he told her she didn't act like an elf too. She told him she was raised by humans and they didn't know how elves acted. Then he told her to keep quiet. Then she disappeared and told him to go and study his stone. Outside, many tents had been mounted on the Darkness Mountain. The protagonist looked at the crystal stone and broke it into pieces. Then he picked up a small knife and cut open his finger with it. Then he held the big crystal on his hand and dripped the blood on the other hand on it. After waiting for some while, the protagonist stated that it didn't seem like it was doing anything. But just then the crystal started glowing and humming. Then the power in it rushed and entered the protagonist's body. The protagonist cursed when his consciousness came out from his body, and he questioned if he was ascending again. But fortunately his consciousness went back into his body and he breathed heavily. His consciousness continued to merge with his body as he sweated. The crystal stone no longer shone or hummed as it did in the beginning. It was as though its power had been taken. The protagonist, resting on the chair, questioned what just happened because he saw something. When his consciousness left his body, he saw a satellite map. Looking at the map and status window in his mind, the protagonist questioned what it was. The pupil in his eyes were red in color, as the status window was reflected in them. The window had stated that there was an increase in activity on Giant Planet, and alert level had increased to level 4. Before the protagonist could think more, he was teleported outside the tent beside a civilian. The civilian didn't think much and questioned the protagonist on what the red planet was. The protagonist looked up at the red planet. It was exactly the same red planet that was causing the dark mana tide. Rebecca, who was still eating bun together with the two civilians, were confused when they saw the red planet. Byron and the other knight were also surprised to see the red planet. Hetty told protagonist it was the red sunspots again, and he told her not to panic. Then he looked up to the sky, and it seemed as though his eyes had penetrated the sky going out of space. The system gave him new data, stating that the giant planets had returned to normal. Half an hour later, the protagonist placed another crystal stone on the table. Amber by the side looked at the protagonist, who was staring at the crystal stone on the table. The protagonist was thinking that what just happened was perplexing. Then the protagonist turned and looked at Amber. He suspected she might steal the crystal. Amber was startled and questioned if the protagonist was already showing the noble color. The protagonist wanted to let Amber test the crystal, but looking at her, he bet that she would wreak havoc. He smiled when he heard from a guard that Rebecca had come back from surveying the land. Amber, hiding at the back, looked at Rebecca's confused face. Amber laughed evilly because she knew that it was definitely an experiment, while Rebecca asked what to do with the crystal. He told her that the crystal allowed people to see above the ground higher than the clouds. Rebecca happily questioned if he meant the arcane eyes. He told her it was somewhere higher than even the arcane eyes. After dripping her blood on it, Rebecca stated that she couldn't see anything. The protagonist stated that normal people can't use the crystal, even himself couldn't do it. Rebecca looked down sadly and told the protagonist it was because her talent was poor. The protagonist told her it was not because of her, but because the crystal was not meant for normal people. Then he told her he wanted to hear the result of her land survey. She told him that they followed the map he drew and found an untamed land good for farming. The protagonist told her the map was from 10 years ago and the part he drew were the safe zone, but he told them not to go there for the time being. She agreed she won't go there for the time being. Outside, the weather had returned to normal. The protagonist walked outside and looked at the surrounding environment. Then he smiled and stated that once they were done digging the first batch of ore, their domain will enter a steel age. Then he looked down and stated that the improvement was too slow. Amber told him that the workers were the most active, fast-moving bunch of serfs she had ever seen. She stated that when she saw him give them meat and abolished whipping, she thought that he was a good person. The protagonist stated that he was a good person and did not blame them for their tardiness. He stated that the construction speed of the campsite could not keep up with his plan. Amber stated that his plans were unrealistic and he had been asking weird for the past 2 days. She stated that they were still building the campsite, but he was already thinking about building a city. The protagonist stated that he was worried about the world ending, the sky falling, and alien visitors touching down. Just then, someone called out to the protagonist, who was conversing with Amber. It was Betty. She was running towards them and telling the protagonist that Lady Hetty was looking for him. The protagonist then asked her why Hetty was looking for him. After panting because she was out of breath, she told the protagonist that she forgot. At the other side, Hetty and a group of people were waiting for the protagonist. It was none other than Philip, who came to visit them and was stunned by what he saw in front of him. He was shocked and questioned Hetty what was going on. Philip stated that the men working on the site were the foremen that he picked. There were at most warriors who could write a few words. But now they were not holding wipes for wiping serfs, but wooden boards for taking notes. Hetty stated that the simple method the protagonist used would work out in that way, and Philip asked what method he used. Then she told Philip that the protagonist has created some rules for the Cecil domain. Philip stated that the protagonist might have used the ancient honor and virtues to inspire the serf. Philip was stumped for word when Hetty told him that the protagonist gave them meat. The protagonist came and thanked Philip for his hard work, telling him to meet Hetty to tell him the new rules. He also told Philip that Sir Byron will provide new equipment for him, and Philip questioned what equipment. The protagonist stated that it was definitely a good stuff. Philip was timid when he heard the protagonist word. Then he went to meet Sir Byron. Entering the equipment building, he met Sir Byron and was given some equipment to wear. Philip was surprised to have received an enchanted sword, which was enchanted with elemental resistance warding. He also got an enchanted armor, which was also very precious equipment. Not to mention that the military that the protagonist formed are using crystal from 709 years ago. As for Amber, she was busy using the so-called ancient crystal to play around while listening to the murmuring. At the other side, Philip was using the equipment he got to envy others when Amber saw that she mistakenly threw her crystal into the river. She was so angry that she glared at the protagonist and Philip while making sure to dry the crystal up. Philip stated that the equipment were all precious, and enchanted equipment could not even be found in the Cecil domain. Amber had an evil plan and picked up the protagonist crystal, trying to throw it into the river, but was caught by the protagonist. The protagonist ignored Amber's babbling and told Philip that good steel should be used very well, or else it would be left there to rot. Philip knelt down and told him that his family had always worshipped the god of warriors and night, kale, and never carry wealth around. The protagonist smiled and stated that Philip was a very interesting person. Philip stated that with the enchanted equipment they would be able to fight with mutant monsters. He told the protagonist that if they produce more, it would be good. But the protagonist told him that the equipment could not be produced again. Philip was confused and asked why it could not be produced again. The protagonist stated that it was because they will lose one when they use one, so Philip asked what they should do. The protagonist stated that they just need to create their own equipment before they lose more. Just then, Betty came and told the protagonist that Rebecca was looking for him. He asked why Rebecca was looking for him. The protagonist already lost hope of Betty's bad memory, so when he heard that she forgot, he didn't react much. The red sunspot, as was recorded in Gawain's Cecil memory, showed that whenever the red spot appeared, the mana in Earth surges. Inside the smithy, where all different type of equipment are forged, the protagonist walked in. It seems like the smith man was trying to forge a new weapon as the metal in the steel pot boiled. It was poured down and flowed through in a straight sword line. The protagonist asked if the smith man was the one who made the furnace. The protagonist touched some symbol drawn on the furnace as the smith man told him he was indeed part of the people who forged the furnace. He stated that he made half of the furnace, and the other part was made by his apprentice. Rebecca told the protagonist that Hamor the smith man was the best smith in the entire Cecil domain, and he inlaid the arcane on the furnace. Looking at the arcane, the protagonist realized that using Magus didn't require any talent or knowledge to use. Then the protagonist stated that since Hamor still had some ore, he asked how many weapons he could refine from the furnace in a day. Hamor told the protagonist that if he had enough ore, he could be able to refine 30 kilos of iron in a day. But the man was shocked when he heard the protagonist say it was little, so he asked why he thought so. The protagonist told him not to be afraid, that he was the lord that protected him, not a bandit that will kill. Hammer answered affirmatively, but was still nervous about what the protagonist would say. Hammer told the protagonist that 30 kilo was already the limit they could produce every day, although his furnace looked big outside but was narrow inside. Plus, every time they finished work, they had to let the furnace rest for an hour. To let the ruin rest, they had to chill the furnace. And with all that going on, 30 kilo of iron was the limit for the day. The protagonist questioned if he just stated that he needed to let the runes cool down. Hammer stated that especially the fire rune, if it keep in contact with fire for too long, it would break, and that would result in the furnace being crippled. The protagonist asked, what if they made the furnace big? Hammer told him it won't do because the runes can only bring so much heat. So the protagonist asked if the thing restricting the production of more iron was the runes, and Hammer answered affirmatively. The protagonist wanted to consult Rebecca, but she questioned if there was anything important he wanted her help for. Looking at Rebecca's attitude, he told her to forget it. He would rather consult Hetty. Rebecca felt sad and stated that she was also a mage. Then she started telling the protagonist the function of the rune, which was to increase the temperature and control airflow and impurities. But if they could engrave a true magic matrix on the equipment, its efficiency will increase very much. She told him that both she and Hetty could engrave a true magic matrix on the equipment, but the smith man and his apprentice can't use it. Indeed, the world was where magic was the primacy of strength, but common folks are unable to use magic matrix. The magic matrix needed an energy source and a driver that can manipulate magic. Then he suddenly thought of something and stated that he got an idea. The protagonist questioned if they needed to engrave all the energy supply potion of magical matrix into the furnace. Rebecca stated that dismantling a magic matrix and using it part by part, she asked the protagonist if it would even work. The protagonist stated that it was just an idea he thought of. He will talk to Hetty about it, since she's much an expertise. Meeting Hetty, the protagonist told her his idea, and she stated that it was brilliant but difficult to operate. She stated that the output of mana is a delicate thin, and if something goes wrong, both the matrix will be ruined. Plus, the efficiency of a self-charging matrix is also a problem in itself. After listening to her, the protagonist told her to take a look at the plan he drawed. Hetty questioned if he knew how to draw magical matrix, and he told her to check and know what she think about it. She looked at it and stated that it was the basic of rune, and the level of magic is no more than level 2. The protagonist smiled and told her to magnify the drawing. When Hetty magnified it, she exclaimed and was surprised by what she saw. They could further refine the energy from the floating element that way, and this will allow the basic runes to absorb energy at a higher efficiency. This was an effort that exceeded the limits, a miracle made of the most basic level 2 rune that will have the archmage exclaim in awe. Then she turned to the protagonist and questioned what the genius of a magical matrix was called. The protagonist brought out a book and stated that its creator gave it a name, Manhwa Network. Then Hetty realized that it was the diary left behind by the wild mage. The protagonist told her he studied everything inside the notebook. It was worth at least have a Duke's Demens. The protagonist told her that the wild mage daughter contracted an elemental disease, but to cure her, he used the Manhwa Network to recharge his daughter. For a down on his lock-wild mage to create such a thing, which discarded all the complicated structures and pushed simplicity to it utmost. Hetty then asked who the task of deploying the Manhwa Network inside the smithy will go to. Just then, Rebecca, who had been listening, raised her hand up stating that she could do it. The protagonist agreed, but when she questioned if he would beat her up when she messed it up, he simply stated that it was better if Hetty did it, but Rebecca still wanted to give it a try. She still stated that the magic matrix was interesting and there were many good things about her. Although she can only cast fireball, her theoretical and calculative skill are top-notch. The protagonist turned to Hetty and questioned what she thought. Hetty agrees that Rebecca's theoretical and calculation skills are indeed splendid, but her character was not composed. Rebecca immediately shouted out that she was composed, but her behavior tells the other way around. The protagonist then handed the task of deploying the Manhwa Network in the smithy to Rebecca. She immediately became happy, while Hetty stated that she still needed to guide the serf and civilians who had just arrived and excused herself. Amber stated that the protagonist seemed happy teasing his great-great-great-great-granddaughter. The protagonist glared at her and thought in his mind if it would kill her to not run her mouth. Amber stated that she am saying that Manhwa Network was worth half a duke's wealth. Then she started having an idea to steal it. The protagonist told her that if everyone could use magic or borrow some, the technology would definitely be valuable. Amber questioned if he was saying that the magic matrix allowed anyone to become a mage, and asked if the protagonist was having a heart stroke. The protagonist stated that if a mountain ape smashed a brown bear skull apart in a slap, it's definitely powerful. Then if a human smashed open a brown bear's skull with a warhammer, it was also powerful. Now he wants to use the Manhwa Network to forge a warhammer. An old man came into the room and greeted the protagonist respectfully. The protagonist patted the man and asked him to tell him how the land was. The old man told him that the goddess of harvest had blessed the land, Since half the planting season had passed, they could still plant sweet roots and flame leaves. The protagonist asked what they do to maintain soil fertility and increase production. Hetty told him that if they could get in touch with the 3 ladies in the church which belonged to the goddess of fertility, it would help them. The protagonist stated that he never thought he would need to beg the gods and deal with them in order to plant. Hetty told the protagonist that with the provisions of food from the emperor, it was enough to feed them. The protagonist stated that they won't have only 800 people forever. He planned to purchase serf and recruit knights. The old man told the protagonist that aside from the divine arts, they can seek help from the druids. The druids are known for making alchemic potions. While they are not as effective as divine arts, they are better at preserving soil. The protagonist asked where they could find the druids, and Hetty stated that the Cecil house had never contacted them. Philip stated that the druids are close to all sort of elves. Then all of them turned to look at the so-called wood elf standing under the tree. The protagonist told them to forget about Amber, who was a disgrace to all elven kind. Just as the turn to leave, Amber stated that she seems to know a druid, and they looked at her. The protagonist looked at her suspiciously and asked how she knew about a druid. Amber stated that she was still an elf because druids originated from the elves. The protagonist asked if she had stolen something from the druid and was now worried. Amber stated that the protagonist was insulting her skill. She had never been caught stealing things. Then the protagonist gave her golds and told her to settle the matter with the druid, and the balance was hers. Amber picked up the gold bag and told the protagonist that he was really generous. Then the protagonist told the old man to give him a detail of the other problems the land have. The old man stated that the elevation is higher than the riverbed, so it will be different to draw water for irrigation. They need to either dig a ditch from upstream or dig a well. The protagonist sat down and started drawing something. Hetty and the old man could not help be curious on what it was. He told them it was a water mill, and the river will flow beneath it, then the current will flow against the wood, filling the tank. That will cause the mill to turn, bringing the full tanks upward. It is then repeated continuously, bringing water to higher ground. The protagonist stated that sadly there is no bamboo there. Otherwise, building the water mill would be much easier. The protagonist called Hetty, who was lost in the beauty of the machinery. He told her he wanted to know if there was anything to put further. The old man stated that if they build the water mill by the Whitewater River, it will be affected by the river and become unusable during dry season. But if they were to divert a separate ditch from the side, then during the dry season the water will flow according. After that did the old man realize he had overstepped his boundary. The old man trembled and told the protagonist to hear him out. He had done that subconsciously. Instead of acting angrily, the protagonist asked the man if he could write, and the man answered that affirmative. The protagonist told the man not to worry, that being able to read and write was not against the law. The old man stated that he may not be confident in anything else, but when it comes to working the land, he had outstanding skills. Since the old man was literate, he could be able to understand the new rules he had Hetty announce. Then the protagonist asked if he would be able to measure the land and track production if he gave him a form. The old man was surprised and asked if the protagonist was telling him to be a supervisor. The protagonist smiled and told him he was not just only going to be a supervisor. He plans to let the old man manage the entire food production of the reclamation project. This was a job, not a title. The old man could not pass it down. If he didn't perform well, someone else will take over. The old man was surprised that the protagonist wanted to make him his steward. But a steward job is not just in charge of food, but other things. Hetty questioned if the protagonist was really going to let the old man be in charge of his farm. She stated that although the old man was literate, but his birth wasn't that of a noble and might mess up the upper echelon's rule. The protagonist smiled and asked where the upper echelon of society she spoke of was. Then he told her to look around the surrounding environment. He told her that this was a barren land without anything, so she should toss all of the rules of nobility and commoners to the scorched land of old Cecil. A low-born famer can be a manager. Then he questioned if she knew what he did back when he was young. She told him that he was a knight among knight and the first model knight. The protagonist told he was a squire and only started learning martial technique at the age of 15. He faked a recommendation letter for himself and went on his journey where he finally met Charlie, who was dealing with a bunch of refugees. Then he told Charlie he had been studying for many years, and Charlie replied that they would call themselves knight. Nobles are not born. Back then, only people who managed to gather all of the wealth were called nobles. Hetty was surprised and questioned if it was that simple, and he told her it was that simple. Just then, Betty came running toward the both of them. She came close, and the protagonist and Hetty that Rebecca was looking for them. The protagonist asked if she had forgotten why Rebecca was looking for them. Betty did not forget this time and told him that Rebecca wanted to start work, so she wants them to see the result. Hetty was confused and asked what work Rebecca wanted them to see. The protagonist and Hetty broke out in sweat when Betty stated that she forgot. As for Rebecca at the other side, she was directing some men to carry some box to somewhere. Just then, the protagonist and Hetty came over, and a guard greeted them respectfully. Rebecca exclaimed when she saw that the protagonist and Hetty had arrived. Protagonist stated that he was there to see her progress, and it looked like she was confident. Rebecca stated happily that she had studied the diagram for a few days. She told him that the formula he gave her was so much easier to use compared to those rigid runic arrangements and spell models. Hetty told her they were not there to listen to her boast, but how she planned to finish the preparation. Rebecca told them she sent the men to bury them underground. The protagonist questioned how she would do it, replied that she was drawing and calculating as she went. She told the protagonist, and they will draw a line in a yard, and another line by side, then use the line as a constant. After all preparation, they will only need to magnify the number on the draft. That was why calculation is the strength of a mage. The protagonist was astonished that Rebecca had set up a coordinate system in the yard and used the metal to draw the magic matrix. He asked if she figured out it by herself. She told him that half came from the Wild Mage notebook. The protagonist stated that it was excellent and asked why she was burying the magic matrix. She stated that building it underground was safer and it will be more covenant if they build a new furnace or dismantle the existing one. The protagonist thought of the modularity, function, separation, and other attribute needed to complete what Rebecca said. He asked Hetty if she had thought of it before, and she told him she had not. She asked how they will repair it if it broke, and Rebecca told her she left many stakes just like on the tree. The stakes will work as monitoring points for the runes. If a problem occurred in the matrix, they could detect where it lies. It was typically a redundancy system. Rebecca looked at the protagonist and asked if her ideas were outlandish. The protagonist patted her head and told her she was a genius. The protagonist added his suggestion to her idea. If a part of the runes is damaged, they could just cut off the broken part and slice a new part back during maintenance. Rebecca stated that the protagonist was right, and she never thought of that. She called him a genius. Then the protagonist looked at Hetty and asked if anyone had noticed Rebecca's talent, and Hetty told him it was because she only knew how to lob fireballs. Rebecca had always been particularly intelligent in terms of calculation and creative thinking, but none of those abilities were of use. The protagonist stated that it was a waste of talent. People agreed that spellcasting was the only standard. Rebecca, who was still doing calculation with her board note, wanted to ask the protagonist something. Before her words could come out from her throat, the protagonist gave her a thumb up and stated that she was the pride of houses Cecil. Rebecca, who was still squatting down, was even more confused. A tent can be seen mounted, and 2 knights stood guard in front. Some books can be seen on top of a table inside the tent with drawings of runes. This was the protagonist's abode. He sat on a chair drawing some rune diagram on a scroll. Then the protagonist spoke out, calling Betty to help him take the goatskin sachet with a map over. Before he could say that it was the one with red string, she already presented a scroll in front of him. When he looked over at Betty, he saw that she was standing motionless with the scroll in her hand. He called her consecutively, but she let a snort from her nose. He collected the scroll and smiled at the sleeping Betty. He told her to just leave if she was tired, because he didn't know how long he would need to work. She opened her sleepy eyes and stated that if the protagonist was not sleeping, she won't sleep. She forcefully prayed open her eyes and went close to see the plan on the scroll. The protagonist asked if she understood what was written on the scroll, and she told him she could not read. She told him that Philip told her paper and ink were very expensive and she couldn't afford to waste them. The protagonist stood up and went outside the tent, telling her to wait behind. Then he picked up a stick from the ground and sharpened it to have a tiny edge. The protagonist continued sharpening the stick to be even more thinner. After, he gave it to Betty, telling her to practice on the ground first. Then, he gave her a note and told her that later he'll figure out the next step after she gets better. The book he gave her contained the alphabet, and the line at the bottom was her name. He sat back at his chair and continued drawing the diagram while Betty squatted down and practiced the alphabet and her name. Just then, Byron rushed in, stating that the Sentry Mountain sent words that they heard some strange movements in the vault. It sounded like the walls were rubbing against each other or something crashing against something else. The protagonist was stunned and questioned what was going on. The protagonist spoke as walked out from the tent, stating that Philip was in charge of defending the camp, so he needed a few elite soldiers to follow him. Then he told Byron to call Hetty as well because her supportive magic should be of use. He shouted out that they could not let anything happen to the vault. At the other side, Amber was busy fishing beside a river with her fishing rod. After getting a fish, she made fire and started roasting it as the Rebecca watched. Looking at the provocative look from Amber, Rebecca burnt the whole fish with her fireball, then Amber glared at her angrily. She jumped from the ground and longed at Rebecca, and both of them started fighting. Back to the protagonist's side, they went toward the mountain and arrived in front of the vault. A knight who had been guarding the vault told the protagonist that there were 2 loud bangs coming from the vault again. The protagonist answered affirmatively and told the knight that he would go in and have a look himself. He walked close to the vault and placed his hand on an activator. Then the door opened. The protagonist, Hetty, and some other knights followed and entered the vault. They were like the light inside the dark vault as they walked further in. Hetty wanted to tell the protagonist about the open door, but he told her he saw it. He looked around. All the doors in the vault were open. He didn't know how they were opened. Hetty stated that there seemed to be a magical signature deep down inside. She stated that since the gate opened, she could vaguely sense something inside. Then all of them continued walking further into the vault. Byron exclaimed that it was as expected of a thing from the glorious empire of Gandor. No one knows how big the vault was. The protagonist stated that the Gate of Ruins was a fortress designed from Gandor's age of starfire. Hetty praised that the ancient ruin were incredible. Even an infiltrator as good as Amber wouldn't be able to deal with it. But not only that, Amber was good at running away, so he would be able to toss her back to Scout if she retreated. Byron told the protagonist that they might get lost. If they push forward any further, their sense of direction will be confused. The protagonist stated that they still needed to push on a bit further and leave a few more markings. As they walked, a staircase appeared in front of them and they climbed down. Right inside the room, laid from the stairs, was a huge mechanical equipment. The protagonist walked close to the machine and touched it with his hand. Then the protagonist scratched the body of the machine trying to figure out something. Hetty by the side looked at the vast machine and asked the protagonist what it was. He rubbed his finger and told her that it was a mana convergence matrix, although he wanted to call it mana capacitor. Then he told her that the obsidian was connected to a mana well, and the hemisphere converge all the energy and create a short but powerful burst of energy. Then the energy created will flow through the main pipe and power places that requires it. He told her it was an auxiliary energy source of a research facility. Byron asked Hetty if it was where the magic signature originated. Hetty closed her eyes and searched through her brain, then told Byron it was not, but they were closed. The protagonist stated that they could at least get 1/2 ton of mithril and 7-8 ton of obsidian from dismantling it. Hetty was surprised that the protagonist planned to dismantle the priceless ancient magical equipment and stated that it was a precious antique. He told her that it requires highly pure mana to function, but they no longer had the technology to refine mana. Hetty answered affirmatively and told them it was time to continue. The passage ahead was still very long as they continued walking. Hetty used her magic to cast a light particle spell. The light grew brighter and floated up in front of everyone. Then it flew away towards a direction after feeling something. At that moment it appeared in front of a symbol which looked like eyes with blue pupil. Then it went through the door of the eyes symbol. The protagonist and the others had followed, so they opened the door with the eyes symbol. They all walked in to see the magic light Hetty made standing in front of a metal ball. This metal ball was placed in the center of the room, indicating how precious it was. Hetty told the protagonist that the magical signature came from the ball of metal and asked if it was made by the Gandor Empire. The protagonist stared at the metal ball for some while and told her it didn't seem like. Rather than being created by Gandor, it was more like the Gandor Empire were studying it. Byron was surprised and asked if the entire facility was created to study the metal ball, then questioned why Gandor Empire will spend so much efforts to study the ball. Then he turned to the protagonist and asked what they should do about the metal ball. Later on, the team expanded some effort and carried the metal ball outside. Rebecca stared at it. First, then knocked it and kicked it with her leg, then pointed at it, telling the protagonist that it was solid. The protagonist stated that indeed it was solid, but unbelievably light. Then Rebecca asked if they should cut it open. The protagonist told her not for now, since the Gandorian did not destroy its outer layer, but studied it. Then he told Rebecca he had something else he wanted her to do. Rebecca was happy as she told him she was free. He told her to use the metal ball as a formula to smelt the rocks into cement. Just then, yet again, Betty rushed towards the protagonist and the Rebecca. She shouted out that Amber came back from her journey. She told them that Amber, who went out to get a druid, came back with a dirty old man. The metal ball was ignored by the protagonist and others as they went to find Amber. Entering the house, an old man with a long beard holding a large bowl used as a cup was sitting down. The protagonist was seizing the man up, thinking in his mind that Amber was quite capable. Amber stated that the masons and carpenter were already living in Wooding House, but the protagonist was living in a tent. The white-beard man asked Amber if she was sure that the man sitting in front of him was Gawain Cecil. Amber told the old man that she personally excavated the protagonist's tomb, so it was real. But then the white-beard man said something that made her question if he wasn't a druid. Before the man could speak, the protagonist welcomed him into the domain of House Cecil. The man spoke in a flattering way, stating that he was honored to be able to serve him and his holdings. The protagonist and the man spoke at the same time. He asked about the druid. The man asked about the antique. The protagonist was confused when the man mentioned antique, while the man was wondering who the protagonist was calling a druid. Knowing that she had caused trouble, Amber bends her head down to avoid the eye of the two. The protagonist and the whitebeard asked if she cared to give them an explanation. Amber told the old man it was a misunderstanding, that the protagonist was the 700-year-old antique she dug up. The protagonist held her ear and asked where the druid was. She told him the man was the druid she sought. The whitebeard then puffed in anger, stating that when they were coming, he felt that something sounded fishy from Amber. The protagonist felt that he had grown old by 100 years and asked the man if he meant he wasn't a druid. The whitebeard old man spread his hand and stated that he was not. Yet he could be. The seed on the man's palm grew into a youngling plant. The protagonist stated that starting from that day, the man will be the Cecil family druid and will be compensated. The old man stated that he was also good at barbecuing and asked if the protagonist wanted to hire him as a chef. The protagonist told him there was no need because he already had a decent cook. He told the white-beard man that they would provide both tools and materials. The man told the protagonist his name was Piedmont Laurent. At another side, Rebecca was worriedly looking at something in her hand. Looking at it for consecutive times, she stated that it didn't look like a building material. Then she pointed at the Biger one and told the knight to take it to the protagonist. The knights carried it off and came to the front of the protagonist. The protagonist looked at it and asked if it was the cement she smelted. She told him she followed his instructions and the item solidified quickly but looses and brittle. The protagonist picked up one of the cement, and it brittles, then he cleared his hand. Rebecca felt that she had disappointed him, but he told her experimentation was a long and arduous process. He told her he would provide a formula for different types of rocks and soils. Rebecca immediately brightened up and told the protagonist that she understood. Both she and Amber watched as the protagonist turned and left. Entering into his tent, he knew that the world of magic definitely had something like cement. Even the Empire of Gondor already invented cement during the Age of Steel. He had seen inside the ruins of the mountains. It was tougher than the stones used in a normal castle. If he could recreate a cheap, abundant, sturdy, and easy-to-process building material, it would be of great help to the domain. The protagonist continued studying all night, while the night owl came out to hunt their prey. The next day in the morning, the protagonist had sent some knight to get some materials for him. As he was reading a note, a knight told him they had brought over the items he requested. Then all the items were carried into the protagonist's tent as he thanked them. Amber asked what he wanted all the items for, and he told her it was for experiment. She stated that he finally couldn't keep the facade up, and now he was resorting to pointless entertainment. He turned and glared at her, obviously annoyed by her words. The protagonist held her ear and she cried out in pain. Then he told her that she was just a free, and even Betty was much more industrious than her. Amber turned to look at Betty, who was busy learning how to write. The protagonist told her to do what she wants, as long as she don't steal, mess up the site, or fighting. Amber told the protagonist he was so weird for his keep mentioning a goose, and told him she was off to have fun. The protagonist placed each of items on top of the table. Then he held his chin, stating that it was time to start his experiment. And so year 735, Navos Day 4623 of the Pioneering Project, he found out that even using both the traditional and hacky experimental gunpowder formula didn't work. There was not a single one that could ignite quickly or release a burst of heat in a short time. The hacky formula could only cause it to burn quietly in the air, and the flames were dim and weak, no better than burning chaff. So speaking of which, that experiment failed. And so year 753, Navos Day 45, Day 22. Of Pioneering, he used chemistry formula. There was no electrical current in the wire, electromagnetic induction confirmed not working. He had confirmed that there was a north-south polarity with magnetic as the same on Earth, so the problem is the electromagnetic itself. Heady lightning bolt spell cannot provide a steady source of safe electric current, and her thunder palm almost struck Amber's hair. And so year 735. The experimentation was still going on. Hetty had never heard of coal, and the same goes for the druid. The experimentation of stream engines requires a large number of combustibles before they can set up the experiment. But the good news was that they can still create charcoal. The Typhoon Empire created a type of burnable rock, but it was not coal. It seemed to be a type of seawater sediment. He went up and asked if there was a person who could help arrange the entire elemental table. Everyone remained silent, even the usually braggy Amber didn't speak. Yet there was none who could help him. These was a more typical headache for him. He quietly went back into his tent to continue his experiment. Although this was a magic world, but many of the material properties are different from Earth. But even if he was unable to determine the speed of light, the process of light's transmission was the same as on Earth. Creating a telescope wasn't a problem. It was the cheapest form of eagle eyes. In that way, although there were many things that cannot be created, but there are even more things that can be done. After some more experiment, the protagonist lay on the table to rest, but the light candle was still burning. Beside his table was the experimented cement Rebecca had showed him. But this time, the protagonist made further experiment on it, and it looked even more solid than before. Flashback. When Amber had came back from looking for a druid, the protagonist asked her how she got involved with him. Amber, who was leisurely eating, told the protagonist that the white-beard man was a grave robber like her. But she also told the protagonist that Piedmont wasn't suitable for grave robbing. Mainly because when he robbed someone's grave, there were some 200 people there to sweep the tomb. Back to normal, the knight were changing shift on who to guard the metal ball. The knight who just came stated that there seemed to be no use of them guarding the metal ball, and the other told him to shut up. The other guard told him the metal ball was the property of the Duke and he was ordered to protect it. The knight with brown hair stated that he never thought he would wear something like the unique armor set equipment in his life thanks to the Duke, just as the two were speaking jesting about the equipment. The metal ball at their back seemed to make a sound. The brown-haired knight was shocked as cold sweat slides down his face. The brown-haired knight drew his sword and turned around stating that something just happened. Some other knights who heard the commotion ran over questioning what was wrong.